November 27, 2015 ATB, Viceregal Palace, Saigon Settlement, Area 10, to His Grace Field Marshal Joseph Milburn, 6th Duke of Vancouver, and by the grace of His Imperial Majesty Commander of the 4th Army, whereupon it has come to the attention of His Highness Schneisel L. Britannia, 2nd Prince of the Holy Britannian Empire and Chancellor of the same, that progress towards a final victory in Area 10 over the rebellious numbers and their Chinese backers has been delayed, and whereupon the districts of Kampuchea and Lao Long remain in a state of rebellion, His Highness has seen it fit to issue a revised order, for the 25th of November 2015 number 0317, in regards to the Indochina campaign. You are ordered to begin construction upon an installation in the Sanla Prefecture from whence the forces of His Imperial Majesty may conduct long-range anti-insurgent patrols, thereby stabilizing the influence of His Imperial Majesty's government upon the northern prefectures of the district of Annam and curbing the infiltration of rebels from Lao Long. Said installation shall be sufficiently spacious to house and stage a minimum of 2 brigades, and shall prove a capable mustering ground for an incursion in force into the Lao Long district within a year. Construction shall be completed no later than May 7, 2016 ATB. Schneisel L. Britannia commands it to be so. You are also ordered to begin construction upon a highway connecting the previously mentioned installation in the Sanla Prefecture to the port of Hanoi, to facilitate the advance, resupply, and reinforcement of His Imperial Majesty's soldiers stationed in the hinterlands and to facilitate anti-rebel actions in the districts of Annam and Lao Long. Said highway shall be built along the most direct route allowable and have sufficient width that 4 standard supply trucks may proceed unhindered, 2 headed westward and 2 returning east. Construction shall be completed no later than June 30, 2016 ATB. Schneisel L. Britannia commands it to be so. In recognition of the imposition these orders imply upon your command, the 4th Army shall be reinforced that it might conduct active patrols in the northern districts of Annam and garrison the new installation therein without weakening our citadels pre-existing in Area 10. The 16th Honorary Legion, late based out of Elizabethtown, Area 5, is due to arrive in Saigon no later than February 27, 2016 ATB. The 19th Honorary Legion, late based out of Pleasanton, Area 7, is due to arrive in Saigon no later than April 13, 2016 ATB. May these reinforcements aid your pursuit of victory against these ungrateful and rebellious numbers. May St. George hand you his sword and St. Charles his rod. All hail Britannia. Canon Maldini, Earl of New Uxbridge, Private Secretary to His Highness Schneisel L. Britannia, 2nd Prince of the Holy Britannian Empire. With a sigh of disgust, Joseph Milburn dropped the new orders onto his desk and leaned back, rubbing at his temples. Across the desk, Robert, his aide-de-camp, shifted uneasily from foot to foot, clearly dying to take a look at the new orders himself but not quite willing to breach protocol enough to ask. No need to stand on ceremony, man, Joseph growled, waving at the orders. Read them and weep. As you say, Your Grace, the aide responded diffidently, scooping the document, printed on quality paper and dripping with the seals of the Chancellery, the 2nd Prince, the Earl of New Uxbridge, the Courier Corps, and so forth, up into his hands and eagerly reading. Joseph watched as a dismay that reflected his own spread over the young captain's face. This. Robert swallowed. I suppose Sir Harrison finally got his interview with His Highness, then? It certainly seems as much, Joseph grunted sourly. Don't know anybody else as wedded to the damn fool fort concept as he is. The Field Marshal shook his head. That idiot must think that we're still fighting the Horse Lords, the way he wants to fortify every hill and ridge in the damned area. If pressed, Joseph Milburn would admit that Sir Harrison Dunmore, 12th Baron of Morgantown and an old hand in the Ministry of War, was not a complete fool. Indeed, Mad Horse Harry occasionally had his moments of brilliance. It was just that those moments were firmly wedded to a personality that stubbornly refused to ever admit to its own fallibility. When challenged, Sir Harrison was fully capable of moving mountains solely to prove that his ideas were correct. Unfortunately, this stubborn refusal to concede extended equally to Sir Harrison's less than brilliant ideas as well. And it doesn't help that the Dunmores have held title in the homeland since before it was the homeland. That carries weight. Coupled with several shrewd matches made with other leading families back before the emblem of blood and old Mad Horse has no difficulty finding well-connected friends behind every door at the ministry. And now the chancellery as well, it would seem. It's a stupid idea, Joseph said, shaking his head as he ground the base of his palm against his aching forehead. He could already feel the resignation washing over him. The prospective advanced fort plan had clearly progressed from something that could be fought to something that must be endured. It's a stupid, stupid plan. Your Grace? Robert asked diffidently, more to give him a chance to complain, Joseph knew, rather than out of genuine curiosity. His loyal aide had already heard that particular rant before. Still, no reason not to take the opportunity. A single gigantic fort way out in the boonies is nonsense. Joseph groaned, feeling the rapidly developing headache spike behind his eye. What possible use is it, sticking an entire division, plus support elements, out at the end of a nice long road? It would be a serviceable base of operations for the invasion of Lao Long that His Highness appears to be angling for, Your Grace, Robert pointed out, busying himself with copying out the Chancellor's order for dispatch. Perhaps that's how Sir Harrison sold the concept to His Highness? That's almost certainly the case, Joseph conceded. That doesn't change the fact that it's still going to be hideously difficult to keep the base supplied, even if we can get the highway built on schedule. For one, if we only have a single viable route to the base, every 10 squatting out in the bush is going to understand exactly where we are vulnerable. The whole idea of a single massive base to mount patrols from is ludicrous as well, Joseph continued, aware that he was starting to yell and not caring a whit. What, do they think that the Tens will be content to just present themselves for slaughter? It's like the idiots learned nothing from the Area 11 campaign. Mobility won us that war, Robert. By the time the 11s knew where we were, they were already dead. As you say, Your Grace, his aide consoled. But perhaps His Highness sees the ongoing menace of the 10 rebels as insignificant compared to the potential gains? I mean, Robert continued, looking up from his copying, if the 4th can firm up our grip on northern Annam, you will be ideally placed to apply pressure to Lao Long. If you can apply pressure on Lao Long, then the Chinese will be forced to route supplies and reinforcement destined for Kampuchea and Malaya all the way through Bengal and down through Burma, instead of straight south from Yunnan province. Leading to a glorious toppling of dominoes from here to Sumatra, firming up Britannian control over Area 10 and Area 12 after half a decade of war in a single fell swoop, Joseph sourly concluded. Yes, I know all about the grand plan the second prince has in mind to conclude His Imperial Majesty's adventure in Southeast Asia once and for all. And if it all works, it will be a major feather in His Highness's cap and a boon to the entirety of the empire. The unspoken corollary of "but what if it doesn't work?" hung heavily in the air. There's just too many ifs for me to feel at all comfortable, Joseph said at last. If we can cite a good location for this base and build it on a timely scale, and if we can build and keep open a highway from it to Hanoi to keep the base provisioned, and if we can mount sufficient patrols to keep the Tens away from the highway and clear the insurgents out of northern Annam, we might have a good opportunity to invade Lao Long, a district that Chinese regulars have been digging into for the last 5 years. If we take Lao Long, we might significantly impede Chinese efforts to continue the fight for Area 10, potentially giving Viceregal Governor McCarthy an entire area to govern for the first time in his tenure. But if we fail to accomplish any of those milestones, somewhere north of a division is going to be stuck out in the ass end of nowhere, right on the border of China proper, with Chinese forces on 3 sides, in the middle of a jungle where every tree has a 10 or 2 hiding behind it. But those are His Highness' orders, Robert noted unhappily. The decision's been made. And neither of us want the Dis to inquire about our unwillingness to execute our orders, Joseph thought, and nobody would ever mistake Schneisel El Britannia for a particularly forgiving man. Summon the corps and divisional commanders, Joseph ordered, bowing to his fate. Let them know that I'll expect them in 2 hours. No excuses. Send someone to the Viceroy and let him know he's free to send a representative, if he so chooses. He hesitated, then added, but first, get me some aspirin for this damned headache. Scene 2, Clipped Wings. June 8, 2016 ATB. Fort Aurelian, north of Sun LA City, Sun LA Prefecture, Area 10. 2 weeks ago, Warrant Officer Lowry Dutch Kramer had been a proud member of the 13th Support Wing, a storied part of His Imperial Majesty's Army's vital forces with a pennant strung with battle honors and dripping with commendations. More importantly, 2 weeks ago she had made every flight out to Fort Aurelian or any one of half a dozen lesser but equally embattled outposts studding the mountainous Annam backwater known as Sunla, confident in the knowledge that a dry bunk and a hot meal were waiting for her back at Air Base Hanoi. Then her transport VTOL, never the most agile of birds, had caught a rocket, and Dutch had caught a one-way ticket straight to soggy hell. It could have been worse, she reminded herself for the umpteenth time as she scuttled down the duckboard-strewn communications trenches connecting the subterranean headquarters bunker to the outer trench lines. That rocket could have hit my side of the bird. I made it to the ground in one piece, which is more than Rodney can say. Warrant Officer Junior Grade Roderick Rodney Kapok had exhibited his characteristic exemplary good sense and died immediately, bailing out on Dutch one last time, just as he had done before so many ill-starred trips out into the recreational district just outside the airbase. Despite his lackluster skills behind the control yoke of a fatty, as the admittedly bulbous PH-173 transport VTOL was best known, Rodney's overall assessment record was almost as good as Dutch's, thanks in large part to all the infractions he had avoided by not being around when the shit hit the fan. When Dutch had sprinted and splashed her way through the soupy mud of the no-man's land the valleys surrounding the hill had become after months of artillery and mortar bombardment, she had left the pulpy thing that had once been Rodney strapped to his chair, the smashed fatty's final crew. She had almost joined him in his fate during that desperate run. Bullets had buzzed hornet-like all around her, slashing out of the tattered tree line to the north, on the other side of the man-made mudflat from the rat's nest of trenches and dugouts that were the outermost outpost of Fort Aurelian, dug into the foot of the central hill itself. Dutch had arrived at those shallow trenches face first, throwing herself ass over tits straight into the huddle of muddy, half-drowned infantry oiks cowering in the meager shelter, periodically lifting a wary eye over the soggy parapet to send a few return shots winging towards the hidden enemy. Another graceful landing, Dutch thought as she left the deeper trenches of the central network and stooped lower, lifting her knees high as the mud sucked at her boots. The embarrassment she had felt at the moment turned into wry amusement with the passage of time. Just another drop into Fort Aurelian. Dutchy, a corporal guarding a junction in the trenches by the shattered remains of a prefabricated concrete pillbox, said with a nod of recognition, the stylized numerals of the 35th Infantry Division glimmering gold under the spatter of dried orange mud coating his grey fatigues. "Keep your head down. The Chinamen have been noisy today." "You know it," Dutch promised with a nod. "What's the weather like today, would you say?" "What's it ever like?" The guard laughed, the laugh turning almost immediately into a pained cough. "Sunny as the petals of a smilin' daisy. Best keep your head way down, is what I'd say." Grimacing, Dutch nodded again and clapped the corporal on his shoulder. "Thanks for the warning. See you around, Corp." Later, Dutchy. The teeth exposed by the man's grin were stained yellow from the crystallized coffee that came with each packaged meal ration. As water had run short, the soldiers trapped at Fort Aurelian and their support staff had taken to simply pouring the crystals straight into their mouths and crunching them down dry. The effect, surrounded by the corporal's dirty beard, grown out despite regulations since razors had grown more precious than gold, was like a vein of amber sap oozing out from a crack in blackened bark. In Dutch's considered opinion, Fort Aurelian was cursed. When the Fourth Army's engineers had set to work building the ill-starred installation, they must have knocked down some heathen temple or disturbed a whole pile of 10 graves or something. Whatever they had done, it had clearly cursed the whole wretched place, not that the curse had to do all the work. The Tens were happy to lend a hand. From what she'd heard from her fellow internees trapped in the humid open-air prison of Fort Aurelian, The attacks had begun before the engineers had even finished clearing the broad, low hill just outside of the village of Muangbu that had been chosen as the site of the new fort. Probably by the unhappy former inhabitants of Muangbu, all of whom had been evicted as the lead elements of the 35th arrived to protect the engineer detachment. Dutch could understand why someone who had never been to that hill would think that it was an ideal place for a fortification. The creek that wound past the western flank of the installation joined the De River only a mile to the north, meaning that water would be abundant, and the pre-existing prefectural Route 110 meant that the planned highway would have its path proverbially pathed before it. The low valleys to the north, west, and south meant that Fort Aurelian's future defenders would have clear fields of fire against any attacking elements. The fort had been completed in record time. The top of the hill, formerly a tea plantation, had been cleared to make way for an airstrip, and VTOLs lumbering under the weight of prefabricated buildings had come in an endless stream. Dutch's first trip out to Fort Aurelian had been as a part of that great airborne convoy, her fatty groaning under the weight of construction supplies and tools. When she'd landed on the gravelled airstrip in the middle of a pounding monsoon rain, the landing gear of her VTOL had sunk straight through the thin layer of gravel and into the thick, slurping mud below. The sound of the mud relinquishing her bird's feet had been clearly audible even over the whine of the gyroscopes. The consequence of this rushed construction had been that every corner conceivable had been cut and that the construction had gone way over budget. Worse yet, somehow the genius responsible for planning the fort had only accounted for the fighting strength of the division destined to take the Fort Aurelian slot, and had not accounted for that division's support staff, its storage, its handful of dependents, or the camp followers that always somehow arrived at any installation. The discovery of this oversight had prompted a second rush of construction and, Dutch hoped, several executions. When construction of Fort Aurelian was finally completed, 3 extra cantonments had sprouted up to the west, south, and east of the main hill, crammed full of still more prefabricated concrete buildings as well as an abundance of tents and unofficial shanties that popped up on any exposed patch of ground like mushrooms. The overdrawn budget and the rushed accessory constructions had conspired to slow construction of the all-important highway from Hanoi to Fort Aurelian. That crucial artery was woefully behind schedule. Last Dutch had heard, only 50 miles of the planned 127-mile stretch had been completed. That royal deadline had been left dead in the water. The importance of the airstrip had consequently grown ever more prominent as the primary route of supply. Worst of all, while so much water had fallen on Fort Aurelian back during the monsoon months that Dutch had felt like she was drowning when she'd flown in and out of the airstrip, the garrison was now finding itself high and dry. It was all, she had learned, a result of the rushed construction and unplanned expansions Fort Aurelian suffered from. The initial plan for the installation had called for a pressurized waterline leading from the creek, which would supply the bulk of the fort's needs for drinking water as well as water for showers, sinks, latrines, and kitchens. Whatever shortfalls occurred would be compensated for by great filtering cisterns that would retain monsoon rains for the dry season. Most of those cisterns were gone now, battered down and broken open by the hails of shells, the precious few survivors converted into subsurface retaining chambers fed by ramshackle rain catches. The fancy waterline was likewise gone, first compressed by the unexpected weight of the cantonment walls and then broken completely by the regular shelling that had pulped the outer cantonments. Making matters worse, the hill and the area surrounding it had been cleared completely for construction and for the kill zone, and now everything not covered by intact cement or corrugated metal was mud. Not on the surface, which had been sunbaked to a crisp, but as anyone who lived in the holes studding the slopes of Fort Aurelian could tell you, the mud was still there, waiting just below the surface. Which all contributed to the current situation. No matter how much water the garrison had schlepped in from the creek to the west or how much rainwater they filtered, potable water was in critically short supply. Even before shit had well and truly hit the fan, the deliveries from the pipe system had proven frighteningly irregular and entirely insufficient, meaning the majority of the fort's water had to be either flown in from Hanoi or trucked up the narrow, poorly maintained roads connecting the Sunlap prefecture to Britannia's northern foothold. And that was before it all went to shit, Dutch thought, stopping by the timber-clad mouth of a dugout to knead an aching muscle in her back. Suddenly, Dutch was in motion, hurling herself bodily into the earthen shelter of the dugout, subconscious reflexes made hypersensitive by the events of the previous week, identifying the shriek of incoming artillery before her waking self had even noticed the warning whine. She landed hard on the packed clay floor, knees and palms screaming with immediate pain that the grounded pilot ruthlessly shoved away. It's close. Too close. Terror clawed at her throat as she desperately tried to pinpoint the exact moment she'd first heard the dreaded whistle, trying to estimate just how long she had until impact. Even as her thoughts ran in frantic, useless circles, Dutch's hindbrain took ruthless control, determined to survive. Scrambling forwards on bruised knees and elbows, she pushed herself deeper into the dugout until she hit the back wall, where she pressed herself against the join of wall and floor. As she scrambled, she clapped her filthy hands to her face, thumbs plugging her ears and eyes covered by her remaining fingers. She left her mouth wide open, following the advice imparted to her by a soldier of the 35th shortly after the crash landing that had marooned her at Fort Aurelian. When the daily ration is served, just 'cause you're underground doesn't mean you're safe, the teenaged private had advised, the boy with his patchy beard now a veteran of months' worth of those daily shellings from the guns concealed in the thick foliage of the surrounding hills. If a shell comes down close enough, the overblast will get you just as much as the shrapnel will. If it's too close, well. He shrugged, almost philosophical. Then that's just bad luck. But if it doesn't just come down on your head, just the force of it can still fuck your day right up. Intrigued, Dutch had asked for further details, which had been immediately forthcoming. If you're too close to the blast and you don't take precautions, your eyes will burst, your eardrums will pop, and your teeth will shatter like glass, the private had explained. Seen it myself, you know. One of the heavy shells came down only 10 yards away from one of the dugouts. All the survivors were bleeding from the ears and the eyes, and the sergeant didn't have any teeth. Must have clenched his jaw when he heard the shell come down. That image had stuck in Dutch's mind even before she had seen it for herself. Soldiers and trapped civilians alike, staggering up from deceptive subterranean sanctuaries, empty sockets gaping over yawning jaws, mouths full of frothy blood and white shards of shattered teeth, lurched in her dreams and disturbed her sleep, even when the distant crump of nighttime artillery didn't trouble her. And so, open-mouthed and blind, Dutch did her best to push herself into the wall, to do anything she could to get further away from the mouth of the dugout. Distantly, she noted pressure against her legs, and kicked out savagely. It was probably some other soldier, some comrade in arms, but that didn't matter, not when they were trying to force their way into her tiny slice of wall. Then, the world fell apart at the seams. It was impossible to describe, to fully capture in words the moment when the shells shook the order and stability of the world to pieces. When up became down, and when the solid ground became liquid from the shock of overlapping explosions and the air became a solid mass of unrelenting noise. As the shocks rolled over her, each overlapping with its predecessor and fighting against the hungry successors that bit at its tail, Dutch flopped, fish-like, as detonations ripped their way across the moonscape feet above her head. From the dugout's rough ceiling, dirt fell in clods and showers, the ground shuddering with the concussive force of the daily ration. I wonder if the ceiling will give in? Dutch had seen it before in these hellish weeks, had stood in mute witness as squads had dug into the collapsed walls of trenches and into basements below the ruined foundations of buildings with hands and with shovels in desperate attempts to retrieve comrades buried alive by dugouts turned into tombs. Sometimes, the rescue attempts were successful, unearthing wild-eyed men and women from the clutching clay, their uniforms a ruin of mud and their chests flailing in shocked hyperventilation. More often, the attempts came too late or never had any chance to begin with, all of the buried crushed by the collapsing soil, timber, and concrete or asphyxiated as tiny pockets of trapped air ran out. God, Your Imperial Majesty, she prayed, pressing her hands down over her eyes and ears with renewed firmness as a particularly close call sent the ground bucking below her. Please don't let me die in the dirt. Please. I'm a pilot. I should die in the sky, not buried alive. She vomited, then, her stomach spasming and forcing its scarce contents out between her parted lips in an acid burp. Dutch hardly noticed the spasm in her gut, all of her muscles were twitching spasmodically, save for her clamping hands. Her legs kicked out again, slamming into whatever or whoever else was sharing her dugout. Only the bitter taste and the syrupy sensation of thick fluid seeping over her lips and chin told her of her lost breakfast. "Damn it," Dutch moaned, absurdly vexed by the comparatively minor inconvenience. "That was the last of my chocolate too." Apparently, the sacrifice of her calories for the day was enough to buy an end to the daily ration. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the bombardment ceased. The flow of shells, the heavier howitzers interspaced with the lighter mortars, stopped all at once, leaving an almost echoing silence behind. Slowly, Dutch forced her hands away from her face, blinking the spots away from her eyes as she ran her tongue over her puke-dripping teeth, checking to make sure that they were all still there. When she found that her inventory was complete, and that she could still both hear and see, she spat once, then twice into the dirt inches from her face, trying to rid her mouth of the taste of the vomit. "Here," a piping voice said, and a canteen appeared under her nose. Rising up onto her knees, Dutch gratefully took the canteen, swigging from the stale, metallic water within after she scrubbed the vomit from her face with her shirt sleeve. Taking a second drink, she regretfully passed the canteen back to its owner, a scrawny infantryman with an already purpling cheek. "Ah, sorry about that," Dutch muttered, suddenly feeling guilty about her panicked kicking. "Thanks for the water." "'S not a problem," the reedy-voiced soldier replied, wiping the rim of his canteen and taking a careful sip. "It happens. Not the first time, hopefully not the last. Because caring about a bruise means that I'm still alive," went unspoken. "What?" Dutch asked, forcing a smile as she stabbed for comic relief. "Like getting stepped on by girls or something? Wouldn't have jumped into this hole if I knew it was filled with pervs." "Hey, a second," deeper voice objected. "Don't lump us in with him. This is a good clean dugout. Family friendly, if you count spiders as kin." Turning, Dutch realized that she had, in fact, shared the sanctuary of the dugout with 3 other people, 2 in the same army grey that she wore and 1, the other woman present, an apparent civilian. "I'll take your word for it," Dutch replied, staggering to her feet as a ridiculous feeling of being an intruder washed over her. "Thanks for sharing your dugout. It's..." She looked around, taking in the filthy bedding the woman was sitting on, the bucket in one corner that had survived the bombardment without overturning thanks to the rocks wedged below it, and the shreds of ration packing scattered liberally around the hole. "Homie," she finished lamely. "Would love to stick around, but..." "Places to go, things to see," the soldier with the canteen nodded. "Plenty to see at scenic Fort Aurelian. Remember us when you plan your next vacation. Now, if you'll excuse me." Walking on rubbery legs, Dutch quickly exited the dugout and returned to the communications trench, ducking her head back down just in case. At least they were friendly, she mused as she resumed her trip out to the West Cantonment. Could have stumbled into another impromptu heroin den. Or an active murder. Or the suicide bunker. Jumping into a threesome's nothing at all, compared to that. Swallowing her still acrid saliva, Dutch pressed on. She had a job to do. When she had first found herself without a fatty to fly or supply runs to make, Dutch had been at loose ends. Lost in the sea of the 15,000 surviving Britannians trapped in Fort Aurelian, Dutch had drifted through the tiny, bizarre world of an isolated, overcrowded base entering its 5th week under siege. Eventually, she had found herself attached to the divisional staff as a runner, carrying orders from the headquarters bunker out to the peripheral command posts and back. Runners like herself had become a necessity as the generators burned through the stockpile of saccharidite and the supply of batteries fell perilously low. Out of necessity, use of any powered device, radios included, had to be rationed. Every day a wire would be run up a temporary antenna to broadcast a report back to Hanoi, but aside from that necessity the use of radio communication was held back for the frequent attempts by the surrounding enemy to overrun the outer lines of the fort. Today, Dutch had drawn the booby prize in her task to collect a mid-morning report from the command post halfway up the hillside from the ruined West Cantonment. The west of the fort was the side closest to the creek, Fort Aurelian's nominal water supply. Dutch suspected that the nominal part of that designation was doing a bunch of the heavy lifting, considering that the creek lay almost half a mile from the foot of the fort's central hill with a major artery of local traffic running between the fort and its water. When the necessity for new additions to house the overflow from the hilltop barracks had prompted the construction of the 3 cantonments, the West Cantonment had been the first to complete construction and had stretched all the way the base of the hill to Prefectural Route 106's roadbed, on the creek's shore. Now, the flat expanse between the creek and the hill was muddy ruin, the cantonment's broken walls and crumbling prefabs jutting up irregularly from the flat swampy stew. A few of those holes weren't there yesterday, Dutch noted as she cautiously followed the switchback in communication trench over the crest of the hilltop. That's probably all the report I need. I could probably just turn back here and now and report back in. But it's not like I've got much on the schedule for the rest of the day. With a suppressed sigh, Dutch ducked back behind the meager parapet topping the trench once more, returning to the clasping clay. At least the command post is only halfway down. Not like I have to go all the way down to the waterboys. The thought of setting foot down in the swampy, flooded trenches at the foot of the hill, full of knee-deep stagnant water and the parts and pieces of the unburied dead, sent a shudder through the pilot-turned-messenger. While death came easily in all manner of forms across Fort Aurelian, nowhere outside of the medical tents was the misery so condensed then among the outermost ring of defense works at the hill's foot. By day, snipers hiding in the dense jungle across the creek or in the hills were a constant menace, as were the daily rations and the similarly hidden machine gunners. This was true all across Fort Aurelian, as were the malarial fevers, the septic wounds, and the parching, unrelenting thirst. By night, however, a special horror would descend on the waterboys in the outer rings as 10 insurgents creeped across the sodden moonscape to slip into trenches and foxholes, slitting the throats of unwary sentries and sleeping soldiers taken in their dugout barracks. Dutch hated going down to the outer ring and thanked her lucky stars and her warrant officer's tabs she had lucked into a position at divisional headquarters instead of filling some dead sergeant's boots down in the swamp. Not that there aren't even worse options than that. The West Hill post was just as Dutch remembered it from her previous trips to the sector, centered around what had been intended as a checkpoint between the West Cantonment and the core of Fort Aurelian and better known as Water Street, as it was on the way to the swampy hell of the outer ring, better known as the Bog. The succession of staff officers from the various regiments and battalions of the 35th had excavated something like a sunken pit in the hillside, the hillward wall of which hosted a trio of entrances into a network of tunnels dug out from the red clay of the hill. The tunnels terminated in a room carved from the rocky bones of the hill and reinforced with rebar scavenged from the cantonment's ruin. A single dingy bulb connected to a noisily chugging generator in another room lit a table matted with scribbled reports and stained maps. Inside that room, Dutch found the usual knot of junior officers, most of whom were sitting around the edges of the wall without even finding a useless task to busy themselves with. She couldn't blame them for taking advantage of their ranks to elbow their way into the command room itself, rather than trying to find a place to squat in the less finished dugouts with the rank and file. Not only was the command room far drier than the crusty mud outside, the rocky ceiling and 20 feet of dirt atop it offered superb protection from any stray mortar shells the Tens or the Chinese might be inclined to send their way. Standing out amidst the knot of useless lumps were 2 men, only one of whom she recognized. As both war captains' ranks, Dutch turned to the devil she knew first. "Captain Parker," she said, offering the customary battlefield greeting of a firm nod in place of the rear echelon salute. "How are things looking today in these parts?" "As expected, Dutchy," came Silas Parker's tense reply. "Had a brisk night last night. 2 platoons, plus the mules. Poor bastards." The Water Street command post, as the only open area in the sector with anything approaching security, was the jump-off point for the nightly water runs conducted by particularly unlucky units. It was a horribly dangerous task, but deeply necessary, Fort Aurelian, for all the rain that had fallen upon the hill during construction and later in air-dropped steel jugs, was a profoundly thirsty place, now that it was cut away from its main water supply. Two solutions to the problem had presented themselves. The best solution, more airdrops, had been thwarted by the concentrated anti-air capacity of the besieging enemies, the same capacity that had brought Dutch low. The water runs had thus become the default solution to the endless thirst upon the hill. When night fell, the remaining heavy machine guns and mortars mounted on the hillcrest would lay suppressing fire down into the jungle, while the chosen platoons and their unlucky civilian mules would run out across the ruins of the west cantonment down to the stream, where they would fill heavy jugs with muddy stream water before running back to the Britannian lines for more jugs. The Chinese and Tens would, of course, do everything they could to prevent these runs from succeeding. Which was why the West was so particularly pockmarked with artillery craters and strewn with minced corpses. In fact, according to the scuttlebutt Dutch had heard, the shelling of that particularly half-mile square area of the old cantonment had been so thorough that the ground itself had broken. While footing was tricky but still generally solid below the first few inches of mud to the north, east, and south of Fort Aurelian, between the old Route 106 roadbed and the defensive lines, the mud was deep and soupy. "Like oatmeal," a private had said, all but wailing his disgust. "You put your foot in 10 paces past the parapet and you sink balls deep in the muck." Trying to cross that slick, sucking, deep mud with heavy panniers, heavy when empty and heavier with sloshing water, was a practical death sentence. But without water, we all die. "Brisk night," Dutch agreed, her eyes lingering on the fresh coat of mud drying on the captain's trousers, a new layer atop the dried layers of previous forays down past Water Street. "So, did they manage to get us a drink, at least?" "About 50 gallons, Parker replied, his face grim. As well he should be, with the daily ration of a pint of water per soldier and half that for civilians, that accounted for the intake of only 2 companies or so, 3 at tops. Enough water for 400 men, in a fort with around 12,000 survivors. The second, unnamed captain winced slightly at the number, but to Dutch's eagle eye it looked a bit too theatrical. A reaction that had been feigned to meet expectations, not one springing from sincerity. "And now that I look closer," Dutch thought, peering at the other officer, "he's hardly got any mud at all on him. Damn near could be up in headquarters, the way he looks. And wait a second, he's not wearing the 35th patch." "Hey Parks," she said, turning back to Captain Parker, a man she had grown passing familiar with during her month of messenger duties. "Who's this guy? Where the hell did he pop up from?" "Not popped up," the other man said, in an accent that practically screamed Area 4 to Dutch's West Coast ears, but dropped down. He smiled, pleased with his own joke. "James Yates, Captain James Yates, of the Lucky 13th Division, at your service. I parachuted in last night." "Sir," Dutch replied woodenly, wondering what kind of an idiot would voluntarily jump out of a perfectly good VTOL, like her fatty, when it wasn't actively on fire. Especially when the destination for that jump was Fort Aurelian. "Isn't the 13th holding Saigon for us all? What are you doing up here in the north?" "Word's gotten out that you could use a hand or two up here," Captain Yates smoothly replied, a grin bubbling up to his lips. "I figured Fort Aurelian would be a good place for a man of my skills, so I volunteered to lend my help." Bewildered, Dutch glanced to Parks, looking for an explanation. The veteran's face was resolutely stony, any opinion he might own up to concealed behind the grim facade. Disappointed, she looked back to the still smiling Captain Yates. "Maybe I misheard. You volunteered?" Her question was careful, probing. "Because of your skills, sir," she added, a tad belatedly. "Oh yes, quite," Captain Yates replied agreeably. "Been a soldier all my livelong life, just like my father was and his father before him. To tell you the truth, when I first heard His Highness's orders about the new Northern Fort bit, I was really hoping it would be the lucky 13th tap to fill the slot." He chuckled for a reason beyond Dutch's tired comprehension. Of course, Iron Pants Wyman was having none of that, So you 35 there's managed to snag our spot instead. Iron Pants Wyman. Dutch blinked. She doubted she'd ever have the bravery to refer to Lieutenant General Joyce Denton Wyman, Countess of Hertford and the commander of 9th Corps as well as the second-in-command of the 4th Army as Iron Pants. Not like there aren't probably a few dis-army types hidden in the ranks. I'm beginning to understand why he volunteered. I see, she said, stalling for time. So, why are you here? Her wave took in both the specific command post and, more broadly, all of Fort Aurelian. You volunteered? Oh, quite. The chuckle came again. Dutch was rapidly finding it quite irritating. It was just so satisfied. Not much glory in garrison duty, you know, and majorities don't just earn themselves. A spot of action here in the balmy sun seemed like just the ticket to get my crown and cross. The crown and cross being a major's rank tab. Right. Actually, Yates squinted at her collar and frowned at what he saw. You aren't a 35 there either, are you? Ah, Dutchy, was it? He blinked. Is that your given name? Chief Warrant Officer 2 Lowry Kramer, late of the 13th Support Wing, she replied, a bit testily. No sir, Dutchy isn't my given name. Most people call me Dutch, on account of the last name. Ah, so you're a 13-2, eh? Yates' grin widened by a tooth, clearly pleased with himself. After a fashion, I suppose. A 13 on the wing. She's a 35 there, Captain Parks, broke in, his voice tired. She's also here to take a report, isn't she? Yes, Dutch agreed, seizing the offered out with both hands. I need to run the numbers back up to Divisional Toot Suite. What were you saying just now, Parks? But she's not one of yours though, Captain Yates objected, clearly not finished with the conversation nor willing to let a point rest. What, did you parachute in too, Chief? Or do you prefer Dutch? Dutchy? She's a 35 there, Parker growled, rounding back on Yates, on account of her having been on this fucking stupid excuse of a fort for weeks, after she spent months flying in the food and ammo. I got shot down, Dutch said, taking a step between the two captains. Sorry, Captain, can't say I was brave enough to volunteer to be here like you. I'm just unlucky, that's all. Captain Parker, she continued, turning back to the man with the 35th Division's patch, the numbers. 2 platoons and 10 civvies came on through last night, Parks ground out, glaring at Yates, and 23 passed back through, most of them injured. Ah. This time, Dutch did wince. Those were bad numbers. At 40 soldiers to a platoon, less than a quarter of those who had ventured over the parapet last night had returned. A bad night, eh? Star shell, Parker agreed with a nod. Lit the whole place up. They must have hauled a machine gun right to the tree line. Ah. There wasn't really much else to say to that. Sort of a net win though, isn't it? Both Parker and Dutch turned to stare at Yates, who rolled a shoulder in a half-shrugging motion. They brought back enough water for 10 platoons, all told. With the losses, especially the civilian losses scratched. More water for us, Parker finished, nodding with unwilling agreement. Still not enough, Dutch muttered unhappily. The water runs. They just aren't working out. Men are cheaper than VTOLs, Yates pointed out, though I'm sure you don't need me to tell you as much, eh, Dutchy? Dutch will work, she replied curtly. Thank you for your report, Captain Parker. I will pass it on to the duty officer immediately. Captain Yates, turning on her heel, she strode out of the rude bunker at the heart of Water Street and back out into the muck of the trench network. Which, for all the mud and the shit and the blood, not to mention the tiny bits of the unlucky recipients of the daily ration everywhere, has the advantage of lacking Captain Yates completely. Back at divisional headquarters, safely below the hilltop in one of the few purpose-built bunkers available at Fort Aurelian, the mood was little better. Despite being hundreds of yards away from the Water Street command post and further yet from the suffering soldiers trapped in the muddy hell of the West Cantonment and the outer ring defenses, the eyes were all the same. Exhausted, thirsty, and desperate for any good news, the major who took Dutch's report visibly sagged in his chair at the report that only 50 gallons had made the trip from the creek to the fort the previous night. 50 gallons, Emperor preserve us. The duty officer took his glasses off and rubbed at his bleary red eyes. That's nothing, next to nothing. Yes, sir, Dutch acknowledged. Captain Parker noted the use of a star shell by enemy forces once the water party was out beyond our defensive lines. He also indicated that they had placed a machine gun at the tree line. They knew where we were going. Of course they knew where we were going, the major snapped. We go to the same damned creek every bloody night. Yes, sir, Dutch agreed. Perhaps we should stop. Perhaps we should. The major sagged deeper into his chair. But then what, warrant officer? Every pint we can't pull out of the creek comes from our stockpiled rainwater or the reserve from the last airdrop. You more than anybody short of Baron Traub should know just how deep those reserves are, and how few drops have been successful of late. Before Dutch could find an answer to that comment, the door to the duty room burst open. Message from the radio room, sir, the corporal who ran into the room announced, brandishing a scrap of paper torn from a notebook. The daily from Hanoi just came in. Reinforcements are coming. Reinforcements? Dutch breathed, turning to stare at the soldier. They're coming to relieve Fort Aurelian? Just so, came the enthusiastic reply. The Nightmare Corps landed in Hanoi, a whole brigade of them. They'll be linking up with the 23rd and the 3rd Honorary, then they're all marching up country to crack the damned Chinaman wide open around us. The 23rd Infantry Division and the 3rd Honorary Legion. Dutch's mind reeled at this sudden turn of events. The 23rd was the 35th Sister Division, the other half of the 17th Corps, while the 3rd Honorary Legion was one of the oldest honorary units and one of the few considered on par with true Britannian units. It was also a division-sized unit in its own right. Plus a full brigade of nightmares, that's at least 35,000 men and 300 nightmares, rolling to our rescue. That's one hell of a relief force. Well then, the major remarked caustically, cramming his glasses back onto his face, in that case, they'd better be bringing their own damned water, because the 35th certainly isn't going to share. The deflating comment, perhaps made by the duty officer to prevent his own long-numbed hopes from rising anew, passed far below Dutch's feet. All of a sudden, though she was still in the bunker room, still entombed in the open-air graveyard that was Fort Aurelian, the grounded VTOL pilot's head was in the clouds. Back where she belonged. She knew it was foolish, especially at this first news of a relief that might not arrive for days or even weeks, but Dutch couldn't help herself. After so long spent in the stinking, sodden horror of Fort Aurelian, after sprinting away from her burning fatty and away from the charred thing that had been her sensible, trusty co-pilot. After days of cowering under the pounding Chinese artillery and thirsty nights spent sucking on stones in a vain attempt to soothe a thirst so dire that it kept her awake. After watching men and women die gutshot, shrapnel-ridden, malarial, and suicidal, watching doughty soldiers scream and gibber under the incessant shelling and watching cheeks hollow and eyes sink after foodless days. For a moment, Lowry Kramer allowed herself to believe that, one blessed day, her clipped wings would spread once more and would carry her up into the clouds, and she would leave the jungle mud of Fort Aurelian far below her and far, far away. Scene 3. Futility. August 10, 2016 ATB. A pass in the Tiezhua Mountains near Lo, 40 miles east of Fort Aurelian, Yanbai Prefecture, Area 10. 6 weeks hence, a great and terrible beast had ventured forth from its lair in Hanoi. A great tentacle in Britannian grey and navy had reached out across floodplains and mountains, rice paddies and the endless jungle. Now brought to bear and bleeding from 1,000 cuts, the monster was too worn down and exhausted now to even roar defiance. The initial leg had been all triumph, a near parade up the unfinished Imperial Highway 27, the land spinners and boots of His Grace the Duke of New Lancaster Sir Stuart Cavendish's mighty relief column marching with regimental precision along the broad elevated spans of the Great Road. Unstained by mud, the beast had sauntered forth arrogantly, confident in the awe its purple might would inspire in the numbers who bore witness to its majesty. Said Ewan Cameron, a private of the 23rd, "It was incredible. I had never seen anything like it before, not back in the heartland and certainly not in the 2 years I had spent humping my way through rice fields north of Da Nang. At long last, I remember thinking, we're finally getting tough on the Chinaman bastards." Private Cameron's impression was common to almost all who witnessed that triumphant exit. This was, after all, a Britannian field army in all but name. An entire corps worth of soldiers marched, 2 divisions of infantry supported by engineers and doctors, mechanics and drivers, cooks and intelligencers and technicians and generals. A fully mechanized force, the 23rd Infantry Division advanced in an endless procession of lightly armored personnel carriers, while the 3rd Honorary Legion followed in their wake, making do with the same model of truck their fully Britannian comrades used to haul supplies for transport. Behind the main body of mechanized infantry, still more trucks followed, heaped with provisions and ammunition and all the other necessities for a Britannian army in the field. Towed artillery jolted behind some trucks, and field kitchen trucks rattled and banged. Almost endless fuel trucks, loaded with diesel for the trucks and carefully padded saccharide fuel cells for the more exotic machines, swelled the train still further. In sheer quantity, the supply train made up the body of the great monstrous column, with each division's support elements outnumbering the combined transport vehicles of both. The great and ponderous supply train was further reinforced by the support elements attached to the most distinctive unit in the column, the spearhead that the Lieutenant General commanding the army was depending upon to force a path through the forces encircling the invested Fort Aurelian. Said unit was found, for the first leg of the journey at least, at the very head of the column. In rank upon neatly dressed rank, as if rolling down St. Darwin's Street for His Imperial Majesty's birthday celebration, the 300 Sutherlands of the 7th Armoured Brigade had led the way out of the Hanoi settlement to the enthusiastic cheers of thousands of Britannian settlers and honorary Britannians. When it left Hanoi, New Lancaster's relief column had been the single largest concentration of Britannian forces seen in Area 10 since the initial conquest just over 7 years ago. The idea that a force of conscripted Chinese and ragged Tens could stand against such a magnificent relief, even a force that military intelligence estimated at almost twice the size of the relief column itself, had been ludicrous. The idea had remained ludicrous for the first 50 miles of the planned 127-mile track to Fort Aurelian. Then, with startling abruptness, the finished stretch of Highway 27 terminated, and with the end of the elevated highway came the high water mark for the relief column. Immediately, the hitherto silky smooth logistics devolved into a hopeless traffic jam stretching back almost all the way to the gates of Hanoi itself. Highway 27 had been an impressive 4 lanes wide, freshly paved, and elevated over all the pesky mud and vegetation. Some had quietly criticized the use of the traditional pillared skyway structure as opposed to a cheaper highway built on a roadbed atop a graded mount of fill, citing that a less sweeping structure could have been finished with greater speed and lower cost, but such dissent was kept quiet for the road contractors were close friends of Area 10's vice-regal governor. In stark contrast to Highway 27, the unimproved expanse of Prefectural Route 32, the best road past the end of the Imperial Highway, consisted of a mere 2 lanes of irregularly paved track whose muddy shoulders narrowed perilously when passing by rivers, through mountain passes, and in the stretches between the tiny hamlets full of warily watching Tens. The highway was a huge disappointment. Colonel Javier Gutierrez, commander of the 3rd Honorary Legion's 2nd Regiment and ranking prisoner taken during the campaign, complained after his eventual escape from Chinese custody. Not the finished road itself, but that less than half of the planned length of Highway 27 was completed by the time we left Hanoi. Whoever thought that diverting funding and manpower towards completing Fort Aurelian before work finished on the supply route necessary to keep that damned base functional deserves to be wheeled. It had taken a full week for the relief column to begin moving up the strictured route, a week of reorganization and slimming. The Honorary Legion was obligated to reduce its truckload, forcing the infantry to walk from here on out. They would soon be joined by increasing numbers of their Britannian colleagues in the summer humidity of Indochina as the armored personnel carriers and fighting vehicles began to break down, as did the first of the supply trucks. In the midst of the snarl, the behemoth sustained its first few superficial injuries. A lone honorary sentry was found with his throat slit by a comrade sent to relieve him. A handful of unlucky tens were unceremoniously put up against the nearest wall and shot. Unknown saboteurs snuck into the still column in the middle of the night and set 3 of the 23rd supply trucks on fire. 6 families of tens were nailed up in their houses, which were set unceremoniously alight. A Britannian sergeant kicked a paint can out of the road while leading a clearing detail up the shoulder of the prefectural route, and lost the leg to a crude black powder charge concealed within the can. Another 30 tens paid for that insult to His Imperial Majesty's forces with their lives. That's how it went, Private Cameron later confirmed. The tens knew the rules just as well as we did. We'd been fighting the bastards for years, so we both knew how it went. It was almost an understanding, you know. They'd knife one of ours, so we'd machine gun 10 of theirs. Didn't matter if the paddy squatters in question were responsible or not. If they hadn't come to us to point out the Viet Trung sympathizers in their village, then they were complicit. Hell, Cameron recalled, smiling with amazed respect, if we didn't make them complicit in the Trung's lot, the Trung would do it for us. They'd kill one of ours, then tell the villagers that they could join them or wait for Britannian bullets. Point is, we both understood one another, us and the Trung and the damned Chinaman. And on it went. Swatting away annoyances, the beast dragged its way along the poor roads of interior Area 10, heaving its way through Fu Thomas Prefecture and through Yanbai, coming at last to the border of Sunla Prefecture, wherein stood Fort Aurelian, weathering now its 3rd month of siege. By the time the relief column reached the shore of the De River, 3 full weeks had passed since the triumphal exit from Hanoi. It was there, as the column began to cross the shaky, overtaxed Ta Koa Bridge, that Duke New Lancaster's forces first encountered Chinese resistance. As would be the routine for the ensuing week, there were no Chinese to be seen, nor hardly any tens. A sentry might see a flicker of a face through the brush, or perhaps a particularly aggressive patrol might be able to chase down and subdue a living captive for interrogation, but by and large the only tens the column encountered in Sunla Prefecture were either already dead or soon to be. After the first woman carrying the swaddled form of what an unwary patrol mistook for a baby detonated in a suicidal blast that took 3 honorary legionaries with her, any 10 approaching the column was shot on sight. Those tens the Britannians did see were unimportant compared to the observers they missed, lying prone in the mud and elephant grass and reporting the column's position back to the Chinese regulars up in the hills or deeper in Sun Louisiana. From those hills and hidden bases came the lash of artillery fire. Mortars smuggled close to the column by grimly determined 10 partisans dropped from above with shrill whistles while Chinese howitzers sent 105 and 120 mm shells screaming down upon the long, vulnerable stretch of the column. The field artillery attached to the relief column of course attempted counter-battery fire, but without observers or really any way of knowing where the unseen tormentors were. The attempted suppression was ineffectual at best. Worst, the need to disconnect the artillery pieces from their towing vehicles and the fury of the Britannian reply to the Chinese fire did nothing but slow the column still further and provide the hidden observers with the exact locations of Britannian artillery, which they dutifully fed back to the waiting Chinese artillery officers. Britannian artillery rapidly became an endangered species in Sunla Prefecture, as did the attack VTOLs that had buzzed overhead for the first leg of the relief column's journey. Tasked with suppressing the harassing artillery, VTOL after VTOL fell prey to waiting anti-air assets squatting in the jungle around artillery emplacements, waiting for just such Britannian impetuousness. By the start of the 4th week on the march, progress had ground to an effective halt for Sir Stuart's forces. The sound of explosions great and small was an almost constant harangue as Chinese artillery sent irregular and variable bursts of hate slashing down from above, while roadside mines and grenades hurled from the undergrowth by insurgent tens erupted from the sides. Infantry patrols sent into the bush to clear insurgent fire teams and observers away from the column vanished into the green moor, while squads of Sutherlands found themselves almost immediately sunk down in the soft red mud, the tens retreating away and leaving the bogged nightmares with nothing to do but squelch ignominiously back to the wallowing column. That was when supplies began to truly run low. The relief was supposed to arrive at Fort Aurelian within 2 weeks, 3 at the outside, and the siege was meant to be lifted almost immediately. Duke New Lancaster had sent word back to Hanoi and ordered the dispatch of further supply, as well as vehicles to convey the wounded back to the settlement, but the previously tranquil roads of Area 10 now bristled with explosives both improvised and manufactured, while the jungles crawled with snipers and ambushing parties of tens, armed to the teeth and disinclined to show anything approaching mercy. Ambulance loads of Britannian casualties were hacked to death and left nailed to the trestles of the Imperial Highway. Burnt-out trucks and wrecked VTOLs blazed an iron road from Hanoi to Sunla. Rationing became necessary, not only of fuel but also of spare parts, medical supplies, food, and, increasingly, water. With the Britannian counter-battery capability degraded, Chinese artillery began to target any concentration of supply vehicles, almost dismissively ignoring the armored personnel carriers and nightmares in favor of the soft-skinned trucks and support vehicles. It got to the point where our captain warned us not to go out alone, or with men from other units, recalled Lieutenant Eddie Bauer. It was too risky, too likely to leave you with a knife in your back and your rations shared out among the bastards who put it there. Our battalion held together, as did most of the 23rd, but in some of the support units and especially among the honoraries, discipline was all but gone by the end of July. Morale began to break down. Officers at all levels of command, from lieutenants commanding platoons all the way up to the lieutenant general commanding the entire column, the Duke of New Lancaster himself, grew increasingly dubious of the chances of relieving Fort Aurelian. In quiet conferences between trusted brother officers, more and more voices began venturing their thoughts about turning back to Hanoi to regroup and replenish. One particularly daring lieutenant colonel of the 23rd made bold to say that the entire relief had already failed and they might as well head back to Hanoi before someone else had to come out to relieve them as well. For his cowardice, that particular disgrace was quickly shot by the military police. His words, the thoughts of many in both the ranks and the officers' mess, were less easily dispatched. A handful of honoraries tried to desert. After a night riven by the sound of screaming, an extra-strength patrol sent to bring the deserters back to face military justice found their work already accomplished by the hands of the vengeful tens. Unable to flee and unable to handle what was rapidly becoming a siege situation, no matter that the column was still technically mobile, the suicides began. Singly or in pairs, soldiers found an escape from the roadbound hell. Discipline began to collapse, prompting officers and military policemen to lash out at insubordinate soldiers with mounting brutality. Before Indochina, I had ordered a total of 3 floggings during the entirety of my career with the 3rd Honorary, Colonel Gutierrez admitted. The entire legion, barring the greenest recruits, were career men, and all were acutely aware of the general regard the 3rd enjoyed as an honorary unit with a service history more distinguished than most Britannian divisions. In Sunla, though 3 floggings was a good day, almost outstanding, he chuckled wryly. We damn near ran out of rope, we were hanging so many barracks room lawyers and compromisos. We left an orchard in our wake. At last, by the end of the 5th week, not even the Duke of New Lancaster could find the optimism necessary to continue the plodding, painful advance. Still 10 miles out from Fort Aurelian, the besieged base's hilltop redoubt tantalizingly visible to the advance scouts from their ridgetop positions, the great beast, now wounded, turned back. It was not permitted to retreat in peace. Flush with supplies, the unseen Chinese artillerists continued their explosive deluge, endlessly flaying the rearguard with shrapnel and high explosive. Every other tree and shrub seemed to have a 10 lurking behind it, who leaned out of cover only to make a handful of hurried patshots at the relief column's flanks before diving back into the jungle under a fusillade of return fire. And always the mines, always the booby traps, always the tripwires and the buried fuses. It came as a surprise to the surviving engineers of the column that the bridge over the Doi was intact when Duke New Lancaster's command retraced their footsteps back across its span, and the comparatively intact state of Prefectural Route 37 was also a surprise. By contrast, the network of tiny unpaved roads had been deliberately undermined by the Tens to render them impassable to vehicles, leaving only a single viable route forwards. Attempting to turn and make a stand was not an option. Every village and town between Chiangshan and Bakyen was burnt, the water fouled, the fields left barren of even the green rice. The already gloomy resignation bit harder as the relief column trudged on down a single unbroken line of intact roads towards Hanoi. Harried on three sides, with every alternative route destroyed and trapped in a land that may as well be a desert for all the food or clean water it offered, it was clear to all in New Lancaster's column that they were being herded forwards. Even the strength to choose their course had been sapped away, worn by shell, by mine, by endless ambush and constant hunger and thirst. The column trudged on, leaving broken-down vehicles and dead men in its wake, fleeing an enemy they had yet to see over the course of the short, brutal campaign. Nobody even pretended to care about Fort Aurelian any longer. Fort Aurelian? Private Cameron chuckled, shaking his head. Who gave a shit about them? Who could be asked to give a shit about the men in the next regiment, or even the next battalion? He leaned forward in his seat, eyes intent. I'll tell you who gave a shit about the men in the next regiment, the idiots too stupid to survive the retreat from Sun La. Want to know who survived? The bastards. The ones who stole rations, who bribed and bullied extra food and ammunition out of the quartermasters, the ones who didn't share their last heals and scraps, that's who survived. On Sir Cavendish's wild ride, if you gave a shit about anybody else, you died. They're probably still mouldering in that goddamned jungle. The bleeding hearts are, finally, strung out in a pass in the Tazua Mountains, just at the border of the damned Sunla Prefecture and the cursed Yenbai Prefecture. The enemy at last showed their face, offering battle only now that the Britannians were almost entirely dismounted, save for the 7th Armoured Brigade and their few straggling support vehicles. You really can't begin to understand how we felt at that moment, if you weren't there, said Lieutenant Bowers, closing his eyes at the memory. 6 weeks of hell, where the majority of the fighting was in the ranks, between the men, and then cresting over that ridge, halfway through the pass, and then Chinaman. Chinaman on every ridge, on every mountain. The confrontation, later called the Near-Lo Massacre despite the battle taking place some distance from the town in question, was the fulfillment of a strategy devised by General Win Min Hu, leader of the Viet Trung's Northern Department, and Field Marshal Qin Zuan of the Southern Command of the Indochina Army, of the Federation of China. Called tuna hunting in reference to the traditional practice of funneling schools of tuna into smaller and smaller netted corrals, the Duke of New Lancaster's relief column had similarly been guided into an increasingly untenable strategic position during its time in the Sun La Prefecture. Now, its momentum bled away and its supplies stretched to the breaking point. Sir Stuart and his staff were left with a force still 30,000 strong yet possessing an almost negligible capacity for combat. The pilots of the 7th Armoured Brigade remained eager for their Sutherlands to fulfill their long-anticipated role as a vanguard charging into enemy forces, but were alone in keenness. The formerly mechanized infantry divisions were exhausted, dispirited, under-provisioned, dismounted, and stretched out over almost 4 miles of jungle road, all but completely lacking in effective cover. By contrast, the Chinese forces waiting for them on the slopes and ridges of the Tazua Range were well rested, well positioned, and in extremely high spirits. They were also running a supremely high risk as they were also on the brink of overextension, though this was unknown to the Britannians. As the bulk of available Britannian forces in Northern Area 10 had bogged down south of San La City, Field Marshal Qin had sent the majority of his forces marching north and east through northern Yenbai Prefecture. Though the defenders of Fort Aurelian didn't know it, the force besieging them had been reduced to a bare skeleton of its former strength. Similarly, the units harassing the retreating relief column were predominantly Viet Trung, with a double handful of Chinese artillery units chivying the retreating Britannians forwards. It was a spectacular gamble, and one that paid off spectacularly as the Britannian tuna swam at last into the narrowest of the nets at the pass near Low. When the leading elements of the 23rd Division and the 7th Armoured Brigade crested the pass and looked down into the high mountain valley and the village of Ban Kong, they found the road forwards had been rendered completely impassable. A trench fully 60 feet wide and 20 feet deep had been scoured and blasted across the roadbed, while every ridge, hill, and slight elevation bristled with anti-tank gun emplacements behind earthen fortifications. Field Marshal Chin's pioneers had been extremely busy. The situation on the mountain ridges converging on the pass looked no better. Further light artillery had been hauled by gangs of Chinese and 10 soldiers, and now those guns looked down on the head of the column. The remainder of the relief column, stretched out over 4 miles of unpaved switchbacks, was in an equally dire situation. Driven forwards by harassing machine gun fire, the infantry and support units were disinclined to retreat back down the slopes towards the dense jungle and its menacing insurgents. Further machine gun emplacements on the foothills of the Tarzua Mountains, while guarded against any attempted Britannian VTOL sorties by numerous anti-air units, further discouraged any attempt to balk at the path up into the mountain pass. Had the infantry pushed back against their 10 pursuers, the encirclement could well have been broken. Due to the requirements of the trap within the mountain valley ahead and the need for manpower to fortify the ridges and peaks of the Tarzua range, only a few thousand Viet Trung light infantry, backed by a battalion of Chinese artillery and a few crude weapons, were available to drive the relief column forwards. It is a mark of how far Britannian morale ebbed that breaking out back towards Sun La seemingly never entered the minds of the soldiers of the relief column, nor their leaders. Caught between the tightening jaws of a vice and with only a hard, bloody road leading back into the hostile wilderness at their backs, the 7th Armoured Brigade, under their Brigadier Sir Ibert Peenwright, requested permission from Duke New Lancaster to make an assault upon the enemy's blocking emplacements. Such an assault would necessitate crossing the ditch dug across the roadway, as their Nightmare's land spinners would be ineffective on the mud of the paddies and the thick undergrowth of the Indo-Chinese jungle, but Sir Albert asserted that the Sutherland Models/Harken, significantly upgraded in range and strength from the version fielded by the previous generation Glasgow, would permit a crossing with sufficient speed that the 7th Armoured stood a good chance in dislodging the enemy force from the hills within the valley and above the village of Ban Kong. Lost for ideas, Lieutenant General Sir Stuart granted permission to Sir Albert to make the attempt. At roughly the same time, Major General Sir Henry Hyde, commander of the 23rd Division, requested permission from Sir Stuart to advance his division forwards, away from both the punishing hail of artillery falling on the trailing end of the relief column from the persistent Chinese still attached to the pursuing Viet Trung forces, and from the handful of machine gun emplacements established by the Chinese at the summit of the nearby ridge, whose commanding field of fire allowed the gunners to shoot almost straight down into the cowering infantry trapped out on the muddy, near coverless track up the slope of the pass. Optimistic regarding the outcome of Sir Albert's Nightmare advance, the Duke of New Lancaster granted permission for Sir Henry to advance as well, with duplicate orders passed on to Major General Alfredo Espinosa, commander of the 3rd Honorary Legion. As is almost always the case for battles involving field elements of the post-emblem of blood Britannian army, the battle hinged on the moment the Nightmares made their charge. 237 Sutherlands, the still functioning core of an entire armoured brigade, who no matter how badly attrited, were still piloting the latest generation mass production model of Nightmare frame, plunged down from the lip of the pass, land spinners churning the already degraded unpaved prefectural Route 112 into slurry. By all accounts, it was not a textbook perfect charge. The geography conspired against Sir Albert in that regard. The pass was simply too narrow, the ground too variable, to commit to the precisely augmented sweep of regimented formations called for by Nightmare Corps doctrine. Instead, the 7th descended in a near-manic avalanche of killing power, blazing suppressive fire at the waiting anti-tank cannon strewn across the folds and hills of the valley floor. In this moment of chivalry misplaced from the battlefields of the 100 Years' War, the Nightmares truly lived up to their name. Much like their spiritual predecessors at Cressy and Agincourt, the pilots drove their mounts hard into the oncoming fire, certain that once they pushed out of the geographic obstacle and over the broad trench dug across the road, they would slaughter the puny crews manning the decidedly unchivalrous 100mm towed anti-tank guns. Perhaps 2/3 of the frames in the initial charge made it across the trench. Sir Albert's estimation of the capacity of the Sutherlands/Harkons proved well-founded, although the brigadier did not live to see himself vindicated. Caught by a well-placed shell during the initial rush down from the pass, Sir Albert was killed before his force managed to close with the enemy, leaving Colonel Valentina Smythe in command. While the 7th made its charge, the 23rd and 3rd Honorary were rapidly advancing up the mountain road towards the pass itself, whose angle they hoped would protect them from the lashes of the heavy machine guns mounted on the slope above, as well as from the artillery, whom they hoped would be forced to reposition in order to shell their new position. In fact, to say that the two divisions rapidly advanced to their new position would be quite kind to the units in question, both of whom had admittedly sustained significant losses by this point in the campaign. By Chinese and 10 accounts, some elements broke and fled for the safety of the pass, although others successfully maintained the leapfrogging advance as planned by Major Generals Sir Henry and Espinosa. "The fucking honoraries broke," snarled Private Cameron, still clearly angered by the memories of that day. "There we were, walking backwards up that damned hill, giving back to the tens just as good as they gave to us, when the fucking honoraries ran for their miserable hides." "The Britannians fled," claimed Colonel Gutierrez, flatly denying that soldiers from his legion had routed in the face of the enemy. "They couldn't handle it any longer. They all but pushed us into the hands of the insurgents as they fled, so eager were they to save their hides." By the time the 7th Armoured had forded the trench, leading elements of the 23rd and 3rd Honorary had already begun to bunch up at the mouth of the pass, effectively blocking the Nightmare's sole egress, should retreat prove necessary. As more units straggled up to the mouth and saw the concentration of Dugin Chinese units ahead, the congestion in the pass grew increasingly problematic for both transportation and for cover, as the increasingly packed infantry proved an irresistible target for the southernmost light artillery elements. Back in the valley, the bulk of the surviving 7th had crossed the trench, but had found themselves minus their original commander. While Colonel Smythe managed to rapidly take control, the momentary pause in the advance disrupted the initial momentum and allowed the anti-tank guns positioned around the rim of the valley to reorient to target the bulk of the Nightmares anew. This proved little consolation for the closest Chinese positions, which were rapidly overrun by individual squads of Nightmares acting at their commander's own recognizance. As Colonel Smythe re-established command, she directed the brigade to advance down the secondary road heading east, towards the Hoa Ban hostelry located halfway up the valley slope. This position would allow her brigade to gain sufficient elevation to rake the anti-tank positions on the low hills within the valley with their Nightmares assault rifles and Harkons, while both outflanking those same positions and reducing the effective field of fire of the bulk of the cannon mounted on the valley's upper slopes. The downside of this strategy was that it placed the Nightmares well out of range of any possible support from the infantry units congregating in the pass and left the 7th surrounded on three sides by hostile units. In this case, however, speed proved sufficient armor for the massed Sutherlands. The outflanking maneuver met with initial success, reducing the volume of incoming fire while providing a range of targets for the Nightmare frames. Capitalizing on this momentary success, Colonel Smythe ordered independent operation by platoon, increasing the flexibility and dispersion of the 7th as well as chaos on the battlefield while reducing the concentration of her forces. From here on out, the 7th Armoured Brigade began to operate as roughly 15 units of 6 to 10 Sutherlands apiece. Back up at the increasingly crowded mouth of the pass, the last straggling units of the 3rd arrived, ceding the road back to Sunla entirely to the mostly illusory pursuers. To the great dismay of the bedraggled, shell-shocked infantry, the lash of Chinese shells followed them right to the lip of the pass, ruthlessly punishing the outermost layers of predominantly honorary infantrymen. At the same time, as the 7th plunged deeper into the valley, emplacements bypassed by the armored units turned their focus on the leading elements of the infantry carefully stepping out of the northern side of the pass, forcing their withdrawal back to the dubious shelter of the pass itself. As the fragments of the 7th began to range out across the valley floor, Speeding across the valley and strafing Chinese positions, the final paddle of Field Marshal Qin's plan arrived in the form of several wings of attack VTOLs, launched an hour earlier from airfields at Muang Mai, in Laolong. The arrival of Chinese ground attack assets came as an immense surprise to all elements of Duke New Lancaster's command, as no such air units had heretofore been deployed by the Chinese during this campaign. "We should have seen it coming," admitted Lieutenant Bauer. "After all, it's not like the Chinamen didn't understand what air power could accomplish. Hell, they had enough anti-air on hand for the entire trip to Sunla to shoot down any fatties trying to resupply us, not to mention our own attack VTOLs. But, well..." He shrugged, clearly embarrassed. "They hadn't thrown a single VTOL against us for so long that we just figured they didn't have them. Stupid, really." Justifiably wary of the highly capable Sutherlands and perhaps leery of the potential for friendly fire, the VTOLs opted to target the highly concentrated, immobilized infantry instead. There was almost no cover, nor were there any viable escape routes. The slopes were rocky, steep, and bare, the road back down to Sunla entirely exposed to artillery and sniper fire, and the road into the valley led down into an increasingly dangerous war zone of dueling nightmares and light artillery. It was for this moment, more than any other part of the battle, that the name Near Low Massacre was earned. An estimated 27,000 soldiers, trapped in a space roughly a quarter-mile wide by a half-mile long, were bombarded from east, west, north, south and from straight down all at once. Machine guns, mounted on the slopes to either side of the pass, exhausted their entire stock of ammunition, forcing crews to resort to small arms to drive escaping soldiers back down onto the killing floor. Artillery, zeroed in with precision to the areas directly fore and aft the pass, fell in a constant sleet, pulping soldiers maddened or desperate enough to flee north or south. From above came machine gun fire in killing hail, supplemented occasionally by air-to-ground unguided missiles. VTOLs launched from Laolong left, ammunition racks emptied completely, and returned restocked to pour more hate down upon the cowering wretches still crawling maggot-like in the sea of the dead. "What could we have done?" asked Private Cameron, raising his hands in supplication. It is unclear if this is a rhetorical question or a prayer. What did I do? I told you, sentimentality was a killer. Is a killer. I found a rock, crawled underneath it, and shot anybody who tried to squeeze me out and themselves within. I was safe and cozy down there, all 14 hours I spent, till some damn paddy squatter reached in and pulled me out. In the valley too, events had begun to turn from bad to worse for the remaining Britannian forces. While the initial wave of nightmares operating in small units disrupted the Chinese plan to simply deluge the 7th in a sea of artillery, the commanders of the valley-top batteries soon adapted the plan to fit the changing tactical situation. Particular armor squads or platoons venturing into open areas of the valley or within the overlapping ranges of multiple batteries would be pinned in place by coordinated battery fire, with a secondary or tertiary battery firing the kill shots on the pinned unit. This approach took time, of course, and a great deal of ammunition, but Field Marshal Qin's plan had originally called for drowning the Britannian nightmares in a bottomless well of shells, and so stockpiles more than sufficient were available for the batteries on hand. It was a near-run thing, though, per witness accounts, in one day, 6 months' worth of carefully transported and stored shells were expended, all within the scope of a single valley not more than 100 kilometers square. By the second hour of the battle, less than a third of the initial strength of the 7th remained active. By the 8th hour, as night fell on August 10th, the last surviving Sutherlands powered down, their fuel cells expiring at last. While a handful of the 7th's pilots would be taken alive, mostly those who had been knocked unconscious in the disabled wreckage of their nightmares, none of the pilots who had danced and dodged until their nightmares had shut down around them surrendered. Knowing full well the usual fate of pilots who fell into the hands of the Empire's enemies, all including Colonel Smythe opted for suicide via their sidearms to captivity. By the time the clock ticked over into August 11th, the only living Britannians within the valley and pass of the Tarzua range were prisoners. While a few lucky survivors had fled out down the southern slope, willing to take their chances in Sunla, few of those survived the solo trek south and east through the Indo-Chinese jungle back to the Britannian holdings along the Annam coast. For the first time since the invasion of Great Britain and the humiliation at Edinburgh, a Britannian field army had not only been defeated, but had been utterly destroyed. It was a Britannian canny, with Lieutenant General Sir Stuart Cavendish, Duke of New Lancaster, a new Lucius Paulus. And for Japanese and Filipinos, Vietnamese and Malayans, Papuans and Javanese and a dozen other nations who had in living memory been free from the Britannian yoke, Near Low proved both an opportunity and an inspiration. Not only had the single most significant field force in the Pacific areas had been crushed practically to the last man, but that force had included a full brigade's worth of nightmares, conclusively defeated in a field engagement. The Holy Britannian Empire was not unbeatable, and so it was not invincible. Victory might only be a distant possibility, but for the first time since the effortless conquest of Area 11, hope flared in the hearts of millions of numbers. And if freedom was out of reach, vengeance would be a fine consolation. Scene 4, Weep for Aurelian, August 15, 2016 ATB, Fort Aurelian, north of Sun LA City, Sun LA Prefecture, Area 10. After so long spent ducking behind parapets and hiding in bunkers, standing out on the pock-marked expanse of Fort Aurelian's battered airfield felt intensely alien to Lowry Dutch Kramer, late of the 13th Support Wing, now of Fort Aurelian. It was strange, she reflected, for a pilot to become an agoraphobe, but sometime over the month spent dropping to her belly at the crack of an unseen rifle and scurrying for cover at the warning cry of a mortar, Dutch had grown to fear the open air. The sky, once her workplace and personal refuge, had become abominable. No guns anymore now, no incoming shells. Cracked lips ached as Dutch forced a smile, trying to find a sense of long-awaited relief amid the numb foreboding. That's all over now. It's all over. Before and behind her, to her left and to her right, the surviving garrison of Fort Aurelian stood in ranks below the open sky. Overgrown hair and lengthy beards hung lank and brittle from withered faces grown pale with hunger. Filthy uniforms, threadbare after months of wear, looked oversized on the soldiers of the 35th, while swollen legs made the worn, holed boots all but impossible to remove. Bleary-eyed confusion was written large across every face as soldiers and the scant handful of civilian dependents who had survived the siege blinked in the harsh light of a summer's morning. It was the dehydration, Dutch knew, that mostly accounted for those stupefied looks, but only mostly. Everybody, herself included, was asking themselves the same question. How could it come to this? Months of siege, of deprivation, of a heroic struggle against thirst, against malaria, against the damned tens waiting in the jungles outside of the fort, all for this conclusion. 2 months of expectations, so fervently raised when word of the column sent to relieve these loyal sons and daughters of Britannia, all dashed but 4 nights ago, when word of that column's fate had come through, first from a 10 messenger under a flag of truce and then confirmed by Saigon. How could it come to this? It didn't matter, Dutch supposed. Somehow, all of the blood and the tears, the courage and desperation, none of it mattered. They had lost. The siege was being lifted at long last, but only because Major General Sir John Traub, Baron of Rigby and commander of the 35th Division, had sent word to the 10s the day before last that he wanted to discuss terms of surrender. Bullet in the head if we're lucky, she thought. Beats dying of thirst, I guess. Or fire. From her place in the ranks, Dutch watched as the small knot of officers, the divisional staff, saluted the flag one last time. At some signal, the flag of the Holy Cross began its descent down the battered old radio antennae used as a flagpole, one of a long succession of impromptu flagpoles that had borne the colours of Britannia high over the hill, that had marked Fort Aurelian as a tiny patch of Britannia lost in the verdant, heathen sea of Indochina. Facing the line of staff officers was another line, a line of cowards, of sneaks, of knives flashing in the dark and bullets whizzing out from the shadows under trees. The Viet Trung had, at last, set their filthy feet upon Fort Aurelian. It was difficult for Dutch to believe that these were the unseen tormentors, who had kept His Imperial Majesty's forces pinned up here in their private hell for an entire summer. Round-shouldered and stooped, the skinny men and women who ringed the 12,000-strong square of surviving Britannian soldiers looked far from intimidating. Nearly as gaunt as the Britannian survivors themselves and dressed in clothing nearly as ragged as their uniforms, only the rifles cradled in their arms looked remotely dangerous. But then again, I suppose that's really the only thing that matters. At the head of the formation, someone was talking, though Dutch couldn't make out the words in the flat, still air. Not as her head spun with a familiar dizziness born of months-long chronic dehydration. It took all her focus to keep herself drawn up straight, thumbs in line with where she thought her trousers seams should be. There were, she realized, actually two voices coming from the front. The first was garbled nonsense, though she'd heard enough of the Ten's barbaric language to recognize the sound. The second, almost as nonsensical, was an interpreter. "We'll march out a half-mile to the edge of the old road," the interpreter was saying, "where you will divide into companies for processing. All weapons and ammunition are to be surrendered, including sidearms and knives. All food and water are to be surrendered. All valuables are to be surrendered. Any attempt at resistance or concealment will be dealt with stringently." So that was it, then. Closing her eyes, Dutch tilted her face up, savoring the sensation of the sun against her skin as she let the meaningless babble of the translator wash over her. None of it mattered. All that mattered was that she was finally, at long last, leaving Fort Aurelian. Not as a heroic defender, greeting the cavalry with a quip and a handshake. Not as a pilot, taking wing once again to leave the earth and all its troubles behind her. But also not in a body bag, her more pragmatic side pointed out. It could be worse. When Dutch had sprinted from her burning VTOL, over 15,000 soldiers had manned the defenses of Fort Aurelian. Now, barely 12,000 stood by to enter captivity. A full fifth of the garrison had died during the last 2 months, few of them falling to snipers or shellfire. Hunger, thirst, disease, and despair had been the real killers stalking the trenches and bunkers of Fort Aurelian. And now, I'm leaving it all behind. Suddenly, the soldier standing in front of her began to move, and Dutch realized that it was her file's time to join the desultory procession off the hill. Half staggering, she lurched into motion, barely holding herself upright as the world swung around her again. Looking down, she focused on putting one foot in front of the other, step after step, feeling as if she was sleepwalking her way down the hill's gentle slope. When the bedraggled column snaked its way past Water Street, the old command center dug out halfway up the western slope, Dutch looked up in time to get her first up-close view of a Viet Trung. He was young, perhaps 14 or 15 at most, but he carried his rifle with an air of long familiarity. Give him 20 more pounds and put him in army grey and he'd look just like some of the enlisted did back when I arrived. Appearing to notice her eyes upon him, the young soldier spat at Dutch's feet and jerked his rifle down the hill, yelling something in the Ten's language. Dimly, the former pilot realized she'd stopped to gawk and, shaking herself, rejoined the stream of humanity flowing downhill, out of Fort Aurelian. That stream continued to flow past the network of timber-lined communication trenches and over the boards laid over the top of the outer ring defenses as an impromptu bridge, past the half-flooded foxholes and through the ruined swamp of the West Cantonment, all the way to the slight rise that marked the former course of Prefectural Route 106. Further humiliation awaited the defeated Britannians at the roadbed. Overseen by 200 or so rifle-toting Tens and who knew how many of their friends lurking under the jungle's cover, 12,000 sons and daughters of Britannia threw down their rifles and pistols, dropping the coil guns into waiting tarps as an apparent 10 officer tallied the number of each. Grenades were collected with greater care by a trio of insurgents carrying egg cartons. Finally, the survivors of Fort Aurelian were even forced to discard their utility knives and eating utensils, dropping them into another waiting tarp at the shouted direction of an officer bellowing in broken Britannian. Then, the bastards forced the parched and starving survivors to surrender any food or water they might have. The circulating boxes came back predictably all but empty, to nobody's great surprise. The fighting spirit of the 35th Division had been eroded by months of sleepless nights and hungry days, but the urge to save a last heel of bread or a carefully husbanded canteen had only been reinforced by long suffering. At long last, the beatings Dutch had been expecting began. The tens prowled up and down the lines of captives, yanking anybody they thought might be concealing food out of line. The offender had a chance to turn their pockets out voluntarily. After that, feeling numb, Dutch stared blankly ahead as a man wearing sergeant's stripes folded, breath driven from his lungs by a rifle butt stroke. Another 10, perhaps the battle buddy of the woman with the rifle, grabbed the collar of the sergeant's uniform, and then laughed as the rotted cloth tore easily away, taking the back of the threadbare uniform shirt away with it. The rifle butt came down again, this time on the unfortunate sergeant's neck, and the second 10 joined in, kicking the man to the ground and joining in the beating. Growing bored after a minute, the 10s cut the pockets of the unconscious soldier's uniform open and, finding nothing, waved 2 more prisoners over to haul the non-com back into line. They did so, carrying the limp man between them, naked to the waist and bleeding from his open mouth. From somewhere behind Dutch and to her left came a shout, then a gunshot, then laughter. Maybe someone tried to run. Doesn't sound like it worked. The heat was relentless, the 10s were moresso. After an interminable half-hour spent carefully not reacting to the random beatings and occasional gunfire, a great shuffling movement rippled through the assembled Britannians. Slowly, under the incoherent barks of the guards, the increasingly disorganized mob, now bereft of weapons and even the most meager of provisions, were turned back around to face Fort Aurelian. Looking at it from the outside, it's amazing that anybody would want to fight over it, Dutch reflected. It was a horrid place, all red mud and bare concrete without a shred of the greenery that grew so thickly over all of the other hills, nature reclaiming the tea plantations abandoned by farmers escaping the crossfire. Surrounded by a wide scar of denuded land, a thin hard-baked crust with sticky mud waiting below like the world's worst shepherd's pie, the central hill of the fort reminded Dutch of nothing less than a vast ingrown hair in the surface of the world, swollen and infected and utterly at odds with the surrounding Indo-Chinese landscape. In that way, I guess it truly is a little piece of Britannia abroad. If for no other reason than so many Britannians died for it. The thought stirred a tiny shred of defiance in her heart. Yes, she reflected, glaring at the 10 guards from the corner of her eye, enjoy your victory, you damned rebels, but you will never truly take that hill back. It's still Britannian, it will be Britannian again, and it will always be Britannian. We might never see it, but the Holy Empire will triumph. God is with us. Another barked order, another faraway interpreter translating the call, and the great captive force began to stagger back across the cantonment, back to Fort Aurelian. Dutch blinked, looking from side to side at her similarly confused comrades, recognizing a dawning horror on their faces that she felt in her heart as she stumbled unwillingly forwards, back towards that little piece of Britannia, that open-air prison. Why are we going back? Are they making us go back? What's going on? Up ahead, she saw a handful of 10s filter out, lugging boxes and crates with them. It was only as she passed the party going the opposite way that she recognized those crates as similar to the ones she had once offloaded from her VTOL in a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else. The ration stores, Dutch realized, her traitor feet dragging her forwards. They took the last of the stockpiled rations out. They made a point of taking all of our personal rations away. She glanced around again, finally seeing her captors, as if for the first time. There were so few of them, perhaps only a regiment's worth of the short little pajama-clad bastards. Just enough to keep watch over prisoners stunned by their own surrender and shocked to be outside their ringing fortifications for the first time in months, but nowhere near enough to actually guard a massive column of captives outnumbering them 8-1. These are 10s, not Chinese regulars. They're jungle fighters, insurgents. They don't have a camp to put us in. But they do have the fort. A fort that had just been stripped of even its paltry stock of food. Drowning in her horror, Dutch was absolutely certain that when someone went to check the water tank that held the rainwater, or the big steel jugs carried in by VTOL, that they would all be whole and empty, the precious drinking water spilled away into the endless mud. Not enough tens to march a column of prisoners to some prison compound somewhere, she thought, but definitely enough to shoot anybody who tries to leave the prison we built for ourselves. When Dutch set foot back on that little patch of Britannia, lost in the green Indo-Chinese Sea, it was with the bleak certainty that neither she nor any of the 35th would ever leave Fort Aurelian again. They had surrendered, and the Chinese and their 10 auxiliaries had acted in a manner directly after her own emperor's heart. Woe to the vanquished. Coda, an early herald. August 10, 2016 ATB. Late evening. Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement, Area 11. I understand, I replied, speaking into the phone's cheap microphone. Thank you for the warning. Your services are most appreciated, Mr. Reed. I wish you a profitable news cycle. Closing the phone on the turncoat Britannian's no doubt snarky retort, I allowed the apartment's silence to return as I stared at the abandoned cot that had once been Naoto's. Diethard had proven his worth yet again tonight, delivering word of the devastating defeat of the Britannian Field Army in Area 10 at the hands of the Chinese, as well as the main gist of the official story due to be aired first thing tomorrow morning. While I had little doubt that Kaguya and the rest of the Kyoto leadership would receive similar reports of the calamity from their own agents, the rest of Japan would remain ignorant of the details of the Britannian reverse. Indeed, I was certain that all but a handful of Britannians in Area 11 would remain similarly ignorant. That mattered little, from where I was sitting. No matter how the Britannians tried to spin the defeat, Diethard said that the current story would claim that the Britannians had halted their march in order to provide humanitarian aid to local 10 civilians in the wake of widespread flooding and had been cruelly attacked by Chinese and 10 collaborators while spread out and unprepared. The 2 infantry divisions and armored brigade would be no less incapable of reinforcing Britannian garrisons across the East Asian and Pacific spheres. That should be cause for celebration, I thought glumly, resisting the urge to juice my enhancement suite as my mood plummeted. No, the defeat itself certainly is cause for celebration. The issue is the anticipation that now is the moment to strike, before the Britannians can repair their temporary handicap. And even that isn't necessarily the issue, so much as the fact that we are still so far away from true readiness. And that the slaughter in Yokohama has thoroughly discredited any appeal to patience in advance. Damn you, Chihiro. Here in this worn-out studio, my home for lack of any other location I could rest my head with any sense of security, I felt trapped. It felt so obvious to me, how things would proceed from this point. According to Kaguya's excited chatter, Munakata and his conservative faction among Kyoto House had fallen from grace in the wake of Yokohama, and their loss had been to the gain of the nationalist faction headed by Kaguya and her mentor, Lord Taizo. For all of her clear acumen, my impression of Kaguya was that she positively burned with desire to free her country. Asking her to turn back from this opportunity would be all but impossible. Even if I declined to honor our deal, I doubted she would lack for swords. From all that Major Onoda had told me about his commander, Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe, I could envision no scenario where the commander of the JLF's 3rd Division declined an attempt to bring about the day of liberation he had dreamed of for so long. Based on the colonel's previous acts of Gekoko, General Kotase would be at the very least wary of issuing any orders countermanding his powerful subordinate's decision. Indeed, since I had handed Kusakabe an opportunity to take full credit for the only successful operation of scale conducted by the JLF in years, I imagined any such order Kotase was nevertheless inclined to give would soon be followed by a changing of the guard in the JLF's leadership, and to cap it all off, I even gave him a consignment of nightmare parts, tools, and energy filters. Just what Kusakabe would need to guarantee a successful lightning assault. And if I decided not to go along with this madness, perhaps the JLF wouldn't be the only organization to sustain a sudden change in leadership. That might be simple paranoia or catastrophizing brought on by fatigue, but I couldn't fully discount the possibility. The reluctance to take orders from a Hafu had subsided of late, but a sufficiently unpopular order, especially one to hold back from attacking the Britannians in their weakness, could breathe new life into the old resentments. Nishizumi was a snake, of course, but he at least had a certain cynicism that passed for reasonability. What worried me more was the potential for some fresh Chihiro to step out from the crowd someday and fire a bullet straight into my back. But we simply aren't ready. Am I the only one who sees as much? With a chill, I realized I might very well be the only person in possession of the facts who had sufficient knowledge of full-scale war to indeed see as much. The last war the Japanese had fought had been a one-sided slaughter, but for all of its devastation, it had been remarkably quick. Japan had been taken by surprise and its leader had brought the war to a screeching halt with a shocking surrender. Both factors made it easy for angry Japanese to discount the humiliation as the result of perfidy. Not a fair fight, as if such a thing mattered. The war before that was effectively out of living memory. I doubted many veterans of the First Pacific War had survived the hard years since the conquest, not as food became scarce and casual cruelty common. But I stood watch on the Rhine. I captured Ors Fjord. I witnessed the death of Arenne, a death delivered by merciless artillery and an encircling military that the partisans and their Francois mage allies could not overcome. More than any other living Japanese, I know what will happen if Kusakabe gets his way. In my mind's eye, I saw Shinjuku, that 12.5 square kilometer prison encircled by walls, home to just over 200,000 people, despite the ongoing evacuation up the rat lines. I envisioned howitzers, towed guns lined up wheel to wheel in great lines, barrels heaving and buckling as the caissons jumped and rolled with the recoil. I saw the rotten skyscrapers of dead Tokyo buckling, old steel screaming as the concrete dust rose in plumes from shattered tenements. The guns. The guns. I shivered at the thought, clenching my upper arms. Somehow, the self-embrace did nothing to push the cold away. I had seen death in many forms, but few were quite as terrible as death by artillery. The way it pulverized the body, obliterating anything familiar or recognizable. The way it left its victims smashed into the mud, spread out for meters all around. The way men unharmed by the explosion itself were injured by the bone shards, the helmets and bent rifles, the jewelry and shovels, and sometimes just by the dismembered limbs all sent flying. Nothing about it smacked of the human. It was a mechanical death, death by shelling, the final result of a dehumanizing system that stripped the individual first of their rights, then of their autonomy, before finally ripping away any hope for a future and eventually their existence. There was no way to buy one's way free of the thresher, nor any opportunity to reason or plead with some tormentor. It was a faceless enemy, remorseless and deadly. It took everything from you, most especially your dignity, all without giving the poor soldier writhing in the churned mud anything human to rage against. When the iron rain fell, there were no depths of desperation to which a soldier would not sink. Please, please, please. Help me. Did you want prayer? That's what you wanted, right? I'll pray to you. I'll use the Type 95. Just please. Help me. Not like this. I don't want to die like this. Yes, I knew all about artillery. But how could I convince my people of the folly? How could I tell the girl upon whose largesse my starving people depended that she had to push back against the hotheads who told her that she could finally be free under her own name? How could I tell any child whose father or mother had died at Britannian hands to keep their calm and play the long game? No matter what else, the news will come out soon. Best, I decided, that Shinjuku hear it from me. There would be celebrations, I knew. People would embrace and laugh with joy. I would laugh and smile with them tonight, for to do anything else would spook them and steal this precious moment of hope away. I had a duty as a leader, and part of that duty was to make the daily horror of our situation into something palatable, and so I could do no less than encourage my people to celebrate and to remember that all empires died someday. After the celebration, I could continue to find an escape out of this trap I had placed myself within. And if no such escape was possible, I would just have to figure out how to triumph despite myself. August 11, 2016 ATB, Kirihara Townhouse, Kyoto Honorary Settlement, 0550. The summons, and a summons it was, regardless of the invitation's polite wording, had come well before dawn in the hands of a private courier, who seemed quite surprised to find the lady of the house wide awake when he arrived. Of course she had been awake. How could anybody sleep after the delivery the evening before of such momentous news? Lady Sophie had politely accepted the invitation and had bidden the courier to return to his master to convey her reply. Almost before his car had retreated down the driveway leading away from the Sumeragi compound, she had followed on his heels, accompanied only by Lady Annabeth, her official guardian and unofficial Britannian minder, and a token pair of bodyguards. That this little retinue was merely a token to keep up appearances was reaffirmed upon their arrival at the Kirihara townhouse, a sumptuous Britannian-style residence in the most trendy neighborhood in the Kyoto honorary settlement. There, in a flurry of polite courtesies and diplomatic flourishes, the Kirihara household servants had effortlessly peeled Lady Sophie's attendants away, sending the small trio to a side parlor off the reception room to enjoy prepared refreshments, while the lady herself was ushered into the master's study one floor up. Kaguya knew that study well. She could call its dark wooden paneling and heavy-limbed antique furniture to mind immediately from long memory. It could have been ripped from some stately Charleston manor, or perhaps purchased whole from one of the nouveau riche imitations studding the piney hills above Holy Angels, disassembled, and shipped with furnishing included straight to Area 11, to Japan. It could have been the study of a particularly humble scion of the greater nobility, or perhaps the lair of some vaultingly successful commoner magnate. But only Kirihara Taizo, once the Minister of International Trade and Industry in the Kururugi Cabinet, now the chairman of the Numbers Advisory Committee, and always Lord Taizo of the ancient Kirihara clan, CEO of the Kirihara Zaibatsu, could have put that ineffable stamp on the room. More than the furnishings or the paneling, it was that stamp that Kaguya knew, the invisible web spun by the master of the 6 houses of Kyoto, first among nominal equals. How could she not? It had been in rooms marked by that stamp, filled by that presence, where she had learned all she knew about manipulation and subterfuge, about how numbers could dance and figures could lie, how a slip of the tongue could be just as sharp-edged and dangerous as a finely honed blade. More than the faded memory of a man now 6 years gone, it was the mark of her father that stained those walls. Unbidden, Kaguya sat in the same seat she had always sat in. Took the same place she had always been put in. "My hands," she noticed distantly as she exchanged greetings with the man and accepted a hot drink, "are shaking." "I assume that you have heard the news by now, Kaguya," Taizo said, dispensing with the minimal pleasantries after only a few minutes. "It seems as if our Britannian friends have encountered quite the misfortune." "Indeed, Lord Taizo," Kaguya murmured, slipping back into the familiar cadence of childhood as she sipped quietly from the steaming mug of matcha cradled in her hands. The heat was soothing on her throat and against her still faintly trembling hands, warming even though the summer's wet heat had managed to infiltrate even the opulence of the grossly misnamed townhouse. One wonders whether Field Marshal Milburn will attempt another relief, or if the Fort Aurelian garrison has already been written off entirely. One wonders, eh? Taizo looked up from his Britannian-style coffee to quirk an incredulous eyebrow at Kaguya. It was almost jovial, though to Kaguya's familiar and wary eye, the incredulity and humor barely went skin-deep. Those dark eyes, like shining pebbles hidden within a mossy bed of concealing wrinkles, glimmered. "Well, if one wonders as much, I can certainly answer. With what army would the Field Marshal, Duke Joseph, try to break the siege? The army already tied down in garrisoning cities across the fragment of Indochina remaining in Britannian hands?" "He's talking too much," Kaguya noted, Taizo's usual economy of words absent this morning, in their place an ebullient loquaciousness. "Why? Is he in a good mood? Drunk? Is he nervous?" That was a frightening prospect, both to the part of her that was still a child and still identified him as the father she had lost, and to the rest of her, that he had honed into a diplomat, a financier, and in true Britannian fashion, a murderer. Taizo was always controlled, always scheming, always weaving a new plot. "If he is nervous." The old man snorted, as if to drive the very thought from her mind. His hot breath, heavy with an amusement that Kaguya was increasingly convinced masked something else, was almost bull-like in the dimly lit study. Suddenly, the dark walls seemed far too close, almost claustrophobically tight. No, Kagaya, Taizo continued, answering his own question. Duke Joseph has no intention of throwing away the rest of his forces. He sent the strongest Britannian field army ever deployed to Asia into the jungle, and watched it disappear down that stupid highway the Chancellor forced him to waste time building. You sound almost sympathetic to the Field Marshal's plight, Kagaya pointed out, her tone neutral yet attentive. It was an empty response, a mere observation. A placeholder, to keep her hand in the conversation. A response as bland as her smiling face, such as her true guardian had taught her to offer, that revealed not a contour of the topology of her own thoughts. Judging by the way those ever-mobile eyebrows, so bushy, twitched up towards his bald pate, that guardian recognized the trick he had taught her and approved its use. The small smile, a twitch of grey lips, could have been paternal in its pride, if it wasn't for those ancient eyes in that broad, wizened face. Still glimmering, still assessing. Another small test passed. Do I? Taizo asked, and yes, he was amused, at least to a degree. The amusement could mask something else, certainly masked something else, but the geriatric spider still enjoyed watching the flies twitch. His ancient voice, already cracked with age, cracked again with a sort of gloating satisfaction. To give the man his due, Duke Joseph possesses middling skills as a commander, enough so that his baton is not entirely unearned. But, Kagaya, a general must be more than a blunt instrument, baton or not. At a certain point, a general cannot be merely a strategist, he must also become a politician. Like Tanya? Kagaya silently asked, remembering the way the other girl had effortlessly commanded the attention of both the blue-sashed soldiers and her own bodyguards, how it had taken almost her full will not to lean back from the furnace raging below that shaggy blonde hair and behind those lambskiller blue eyes, when that girl had leaned across the table, getting into her face as she demonstrated how close she had gotten to the first man she had stabbed. A street rat who built her own army and crowned herself lord of all she surveyed? Like that, Lord Taizo? The Duke of Vancouver, the old man continued, seemingly lost in his sneering reverie, found himself in control of an area in all but law by dint of his failure as a political operator as much as for his generalship. The only reasons why a noble unchained to the imperial family by blood or marriage would be granted his command are visionary excellence or political impotence. In Vancouver's case, Taizo snorted again, and Kagaya pushed away the thought of how the wet heat pressed against her face. There is little reason to suspect that he earned the Fourth Army with his reputed strategic wit. So, is this just gloating? Kagaya wondered, concealing her curiosity behind a sip from her rapidly chilling tea, timed just as the master of the Taizo clan took another sip from his coffee to avoid any hint of disrespect by looking away. Or is there a lesson hidden behind the indulgence? That a general must be a politician is hardly revelatory. Politics and war are simple extensions of one another, but what does that lesson mean now, in application to the monumental defeat the Britannians just suffered and coming from the mouth of a man who has always dominated from the boardroom and the cabinet, but never from the head of an army? Is it a simple comment on the quality of leadership we should expect from the Britannians? An insight into the nature of Britannia, social Darwinism sowing the seeds for its own collapse as trust from within withers? Something else entirely? What would Tanya have to say about the news out of Indochina? What lessons would she pull from the slew of random details and panicked reports my agents have passed on to me? It was far from the first time Kagaya had asked herself some variant of that question. They had only met once, but thanks to the plethora of reports she had requested on Tanya both before and after their meeting, and thanks to the Shinjuku leader's own surprising candor during their short meeting, Kagaya felt like she had a decent handle on what her... What? On what my acquaintance thinks? My ally? My contractee? Yes, Kagaya noted, contractee works, as far as our current relationship goes. She buys material from me, all the guns and bullets and food and whatever that her people need, and in return she has promised to provide muscle on demand, but that's not really all. Contractee worked, but it fell short of the role Kagaya saw for Commander Hajime in their shared future. Contractee was too mean a descriptor, she decided. Warlord fit much better. Regardless of our exact relationship, I still feel like I understand how she would react to most of the recent developments that have crossed my desk. She would have celebrated Pulst's death, I'm sure. He was never a friend to anybody save himself, and a holy terror to the Japanese as the Minister of Economic Development. She would have mourned the butchery in Yokohama, especially since she would so clearly see her own home and her own people in the accounts of whatever survivors managed to flee north to the Tokyo settlement. But what would that shrewd, bloody-minded, yet, when it came to her own people, surprisingly compassionate girl think, when she learned of the broken nightmares and the long bloody chain of men sinking into the thick jungle mud? When I spoke of Japan, she burnt with passion, Kaguya recalled, nodding internally to herself as she watched Taizo fuss over his coffee mug. Indeed, she matched the fire that burnt in my heart with equal measure. Certainly that fire will prompt jubilation when the news of the Chinese victory over Cavendish's column reaches her, assuming she hasn't learned about it already. Somehow, that estimation rang hollow in Kaguya's ears, off in a way that her previous two guesses were not, because she will have come to the same conclusion that I have, Kaguya thought bleakly, tightening her grasp on her traditional clay cylinder of a tea mug to keep the treacherous shakes away from her hands. Because a crisis of this magnitude cannot go unexploited. Someone will exploit it in Area 11, and the Britannians in their temporary weakness will not be able to immediately quash the first embers. When other groups realize as much, when the great groaning mass of Japanese and reluctant honoraries realize as much, the fire will spread. But once that easy tinder is burned, Tanya will ask herself, just as I asked myself last night, what then? So in your estimate, this defeat stemmed from the field marshal's lack of political dexterity? Kaguya asked, automatically picking the conversation back up as Taizo settled back into his chair, his cup refreshed. Though she had posed it as a question, Kaguya knew her mentor well enough to see the conclusion he was reaching for, and so concurred in advance with it. But asking instead of stating will put the onus for speaking that conclusion aloud on him, rather than myself, Kaguya noted, the portion of her internal monologue plotting her course through the conversation cool and detached. After all, it behooves a woman in my position poorly to lay the fault for the defeat on the Duke's inability to stand up to the unreasonable demands of his superiors, lest my own self-appointed superiors begin to wonder. The rest of her internal monologue was screaming itself hoarse as she imagined a vengeful Britannia, the great Leviathan wounded but all the more dangerous for its pained, lunatic rage, slashing back down on the reborn Japan, still fragile as it shook off clinging shards of eggshell and spread soft wings. In her mind's eye, Kaguya could almost see the incendiaries falling in their thousands already. Clearly, Taizo snorted again, and then coughed when the snort dislodged something in the back of his throat. The wizened schemer had been suffering badly from allergies this year, Kaguya recalled. Clearly, he repeated, spitting the word out in lieu of spitting out the stifling post-nasal contents of his throat. The order to build that damned stupid fort came from the Chancellery, allegedly on the advice of a Baron Harrison, a man who reportedly failed his way to seniority with commendable efficiency. Duke Joseph is at least rumored to have been smart enough to resist the drivel that spews from Harrison's mouth when it spewed from the mouth of a social inferior alone, but apparently lost his courage when the same blabber was regurgitated via the second prince's mouth instead. Kaguya wrinkled her nose at that mental image with unfeigned disgust, happy at last to give her own, much more personal, disgust the slightest window of expression. I wonder if they will even bother retaking the cities, her gloomy mind supplied. Why bother, when all the Britannians truly want is the damned Saccharidite? And of course, Taizo continued thoughtfully, appearing to be lost in the depths of his cup, peering down into steaming coffee adulterated with milk, the Britannian habit persisting even now. The emergency dispatch of an armoured brigade and 2 infantry divisions also arrived with the Chancellor's seal, just the same as the initial orders did, just as the approvals for the budgetary overruns and the late-hour additions to Fort Aurelian did. Schneisel wanted to save his investment, and like the amateur general he is, immediately resorted to the blunt deployment of overwhelming force to save himself from his foolishness. And Duke Joseph did nothing but dutifully follow his orders, all without uttering so much as a peep of protest. What am I supposed to say to that? Kagaya wondered, her conversational navigator stalling out as the silence stretched on. What is the point of this conversation? She also wondered. That question almost snapped out by the increasingly despondent part of her mind that dreaded what this conversation was building towards. We both know what happened, we both heard the news. Think, Kagaya. Think. Taizo is nervous, you realized that as soon as he tried that jolly old man act. He wanted you off balance, that was why he summoned you so early. He's talked a lot, and said very little, but what substance there has been has all emphasized how reactionary Britannia has become, will become. Duke Joseph waited for orders and, when they came, only followed orders. Schneasel reinforced failure and compounded his original mistake. Something clicked in Kagaya's mind as she remembered her earlier internal question, about why a man who lacked anything approaching military experience would be pontificating on generalship. Schneasel was, after all, far from the only politician who lacked anything beyond a surface-level understanding of the military sciences. Another such man sat across the low coffee table from her, clothed in a Britannian-style dressing robe and drinking Britannian-style coffee. So this is it, Kagaya realized, a numb sensation spreading up from her belly, retracing the warm path her sipped tea had blazed down her throat. The Britannians will never, in his estimation, be weaker than they are right now. The JLF is swollen with new recruits and increasingly responsive to a clique of highly aggressive officers. Moreover, Yokohama proved that the Britannians will not stop until they slaughter us all. They will never be weaker, and we will never be stronger. And Kirihara Taizo has always been a man to make his own opportunities, to seize whatever advantage he can secure. It all makes sense, when I think about it like that, and it did. It made so much sense. More than sense, the prospect of rising up now, striking back against the hated, weakened enemy now. It felt right, deeply so. Kagaya remembered Japan, for all that she was certain that just as many Britannian mannerisms had crept into her personal habits as had crept into Taizo's, and she longed to see her country free again. He has no intention of waiting for some lone spark to rise up and set the entire forest on fire. He is no general, but he has generals on retainer, just as Schneasel is and does. And just as Schneasel did, he is preparing to send off his orders to ensure that the fire touches off all at once, guaranteeing an intense blaze. A blaze enough to resurrect the phoenix from its ashes. A fireball of sufficient intensity and luminosity that people across the world might mistake it for a sun rising at last from dark night, rising again furious and free. But what comes next? Asked a voice with equal intensity, as frigid as midwinter corpses stacked in the bed of a ramshackle truck, bound for interment with the rest of the unwanted waste of Britannia. Once the gamble is placed, once the glorious blow is struck, what comes next? What will the cost be, for that momentary rebirth? Will you stake an entire nation's existence, that Japanese intensity will outlast Britannian vengeance? And even if the fire of outrage gutters in the Britannian soul, what about gnawing hunger for saccharidite? Can will alone outlast a potentially fatal threat to all Britannia holds dear, a threat that their world-conquering war machine might stall? Fortunately, Kagaya heard through her rushing thoughts, as Taizo continued his musings aloud, his attempts to reassure himself above all else now as shrill to Kagaya's ears as a tin whistle. Even Duke Vancouver's limited success and mediocre performance is lightly beyond the reach of our illustrious viceregal governor. As you say, she replied, gratified that her voice had somehow escaped her rapidly constricting throat without betraying her. Prince Clovis, after all, has no military background to speak of, and is advised primarily by officers of the purest faction, who are broadly held in jealous contempt by their peers. He lacks both the cleverness to stand back and let his military advisers take the full measure of responsibility onto their own shoulders, as the Viceroy of Area 10 chose, and the wisdom to actually choose competent advisers instead of sycophantic fools hopelessly bound to a futile ideology, agreed Taizo, nodding with such satisfaction that Kagaya almost screamed. Undoubtedly, he would see it as below the dignity of his royal status to simply sit back and allow his generals to run the area into the ground on their own accord. Besides, the man's the worst kind of micromanager, ever present wherever he is least helpful, No competent general would stand for such interference. Would Colonel Kusakabe? Kagaya wondered. Or is he also a fool bound to a self-defeating ideology? Considering who his orders will apparently be stemming from, Lord Taizo, I have my suspicions, though I have never had the misfortune of his acquaintance. As you say, Kagaya repeated, wondering at how rapidly everything that had seemed so solid even in her own fragile double life as an honorary Britannian debutante and as a secret bankroller of rebellion had fallen apart. The chairman of the Numbers Advisory Council and the secret master of Kyoto House had likewise led a double life for more than half a decade without betraying himself, and even before then, he had been a formidable presence in the halls of power of Republican Japan. And yet here he is, speaking to a captive audience, unable or unwilling even now to cross the threshold and openly state his intentions. Minutes are running through our fingers like sand as time hurtles on, and yet here we sit in this townhouse, him talking but not speaking, me nodding but not listening. But now, Kagaya considered, he is trying to convince himself that Britannia's strength is ebbing, and that Clovis is too incapable to adequately defend Britannian dominance over Japan. That means Lord Taizo is, in fact, not fully convinced on such points already. Her stomach lurched, and it took all of Kagaya's careful self-control to hold her tea down. Lord Taizo, she began, drawing on years of lessons in manners, in deportment, in the respectful way an inferior wheedles truths and concessions out from their unwary superior, why did you want to meet with me so early in the morning? What prompted you to call this meeting? What? Taizo asked, looking up from his coffee to shoot a sardonic look her way. Did you want to be caught napping when the day of liberation dawned? Indeed. The word fell tonelessly from her lips as Kagaya's heart plummeted again. The look on Taizo's face was not triumphant, nor was it eager. Instead, it was resigned. Old. Not tired, but not energetic. Not a reassuring look on the face of the chessmaster standing ready to overturn his board at last and set it on fire. So, today's the day, is it? We will never be stronger, Taizo remarked, echoing Kagaya's thoughts. Perhaps he had been following the same paths as she, paying just as little attention to their conversation as she had. For a moment, Kagaya wondered if that was the reason for his nerves, that he too had concluded that he was not the right man for this job. The Britannians will never leave us, and if this generation passes without a fight, there will be no Japan to liberate. They will kill us, Kagaya replied, simply but with a heartfelt sincerity she didn't have to force. The words escaped gracelessly through her lips, and from each utterance more bubbled forth, pressure given vent at last. You realize that, Lord Taizo? If we do this, if we call for a general uprising against the Britannians, they will kill us all once they retake the home islands. There will be no Japan, just as you say, but there will be nobody who can even claim Japanese ancestry still alive here on whatever burnt rocks are left. Only the refugees in the camps in China and Europe could claim to be Japanese, and they would be only a fragment of a fragment. Lord Taizo, if we do this, if you do this, throwing in with Munakata's faction at this late date, Kagaya? Taizo asked, rhetorically, as it turned out, for he continued relentlessly on. What other choice do we have, would you say? Letting this opportunity go to waste would be foolish in the extreme. The best of the Britannian army is battling its way through the Middle Eastern Federation, while the second-raters are tied down in Sumatra and Malaya, or are scattered across 3 continents in pick-penny garrisons. The Britannian Navy is dueling the Chinese and Europeans across 2 oceans, from the Moluccas to the Canaries. Their Knights of the Rounds are scattered from Persia to Pendragon. Even without counting the 2 infantry divisions and the Nightmare Brigade Schneasel just threw away, the Britannians are overstretched and exhausted from 15 years of constant conquest. Even after almost 8 decades of life, Kirihara Taizo was still a big man, still broad across the shoulders. When he leaned forward, craggy face set in hard lines below his sloping, wrinkled brow, it was as if Mount Fuji itself had stirred from its tormented sleep to bear down upon her. And in the face of that pressure, Kagaya was 8 years old again and an orphan, head of a clan of 1, cowering before the brooding pressure of her new guardian. His word had been law for years now, scraping away what he had disapproved of and reshaping the remainder to enshrine old Japan behind protective Britannian walls. That word spoke once again, brooking no defiance, and Kagaya knew Taizo spoke the truth when he said, "We will never get a better chance at restoring Japan." I can't argue against any of that, Kagaya thought dismally, feeling like a stranger in her own body. Her head swam, her hands as numb as a corpse. He's correct, as far as he's gone. But he hasn't gone far enough, hasn't thought far enough, if that is the entirety of his argument. Lord Taizo, Kagaya replied, clinging to the structure of formality, anchoring herself back in herself, pushing through her dizzy despair and trying to argue what could laughably be called her case. I agree that this moment of unexpected Britannian weakness presents an incredible opportunity. But she swallowed, trying to articulate her thoughts. What were her thoughts? Hadn't she been resolved that any sacrifice would be worth a free Japan? It had seemed that way, when she had heard the news of the sniper's death in the company of Bradley Dean, when she had resolved to honor the soon-to-be slain of Yokohama as martyrs. But sacrifices are only justified retroactively, came the grim rejoinder, and it came in Tanya's voice, surprising Kagaya not in the least. If the sacrifice of a nation only buys a month or two of freedom before the hammer falls, then that sacrifice was worth very little, because it bought very little. Renegotiate before committing to such a foolhardy exchange. Before we inform the JLF of our support for a general uprising, before we call in all of our debts with the other resistance groups, before we ask our people to take up whatever weapon they can find to kill the invaders, before we ask them all to die for us, for me, I humbly ask what end you envision, Lord Taizo. What end indeed? The old man echoed, tilting his head back as if the answers were written on the ceiling's dark paneling. Lady Kagaya, how many more years do you think the people of Area 11 will remain Japanese? How many generations will it take before the name Japanese is just as irrelevant as Iroquois or Quebecois? How long until we all become 11s in truth, just as the Mexicans became 5s? How long can a national identity last, without a homeland? Our shrines and temples are burnt, where will we offer gifts and prayers to our ancestors? Will we continue to entomb their bones in garbage pits? Eulogies for Japan from Lord Taizo. Kagaya asked, almost disbelievingly. It seemed so trite. What were the worth of eulogies for a dead country, coming from a man already 1 foot in the grave? And don't think that I'll accept a question for an answer. This uprising. What is the point of it? What will it accomplish? Surely you who have survived the rise and fall of cabinets, you who survived conquest and collaboration, have a plan to survive past the uprising. Kagaya realized she was breathing hard, panting for breath. She hadn't raised her voice, but the effort to keep her tone level, sane, polite even had pulled the wind from her lungs all the same. She felt like she was drowning, the way the pressure on her chest crushed her, the way her thin throat sucked for air like a long slender straw. You won't accept a question for an answer? For a moment, Taizo's fey mood broke and Kagaya steeled herself even as she fought for air, fought for composure, against the impulse to shrink back, as the hard-faced titan of her youth swam back into focus through her blurring vision. Well then, Kagaya, I will simply say this, I would rather my bones rest in Japan than in Area 11. How is that for your answer? Japan will live. I will see the sun rise again. I was born in Japan, and I will die in Japan, so that's it, then? Kagaya rose to her feet, the lingering shreds of propriety deserting her. It's all just an old man's dying wish? That's why you're risking everything we've built up and husbanded now on a final hurried push? What happens when the Britannians come back, Lord Taizo, assuming we even manage to push them out of Tokyo? They defeated the Republic, what will ensure the JLF won't meet the same fate? Or what if the Chinese or the Europeans invade, after both we and the Britannians have expended our strength? Abruptly frustrated with herself, that she still couldn't bring herself to fully confront the man, Kagaya balled her hands up into fists. You don't have a P plan. The accusation came out splintered, almost broken. You don't have a plan for this. This uprising. Finding her voice, Kaguya glared down at the living fossil. How could you have a plan? Nobody expected the Britannians to lose that bad, or the Chinese to actually be competent for once. You didn't see this coming, nobody did. You're just reacting. Just like Schneasel did. Why do you think this will go any different than the Chancellor of Britannia's attempt to buy victory by just throwing people at the problem? What would you have me do? Taizo asked, almost bemused. Kaguya found the sudden detachment in his eyes deeply frightening. Before those two shimmering pebbles, as dark as rocks at the bottom of a well, her momentary outrage guttered. You know as well as I do the mood of our countrymen, and in particular the disposition of Colonel Kusakabe and his little clique. News of Nialo has certainly reached his ears, and he will see nothing but an opportunity to replicate Niigata on a nationwide scale. Would you have me squander the 6 houses' influence in checking his ambition, consigning you and I to the same impotence that has overcome Munakata? Face it, Kaguya, and this time, when he chuckled, Kaguya saw the man who had replaced her father again, just for a moment, but not this time the terrifying presence. Instead, she saw the man who had taught her how to sharpen her teeth against the other clan heads, who had applauded her when she duped Britannian inspectors and factors with her apparent childishness into sloppy negotiations. The one who had given an orphaned girl the weapons necessary to become a power all her own. As soon as the last Sutherland collapsed into the Indo-Chinese mud, this was inevitable. Not only in Area 10, but in Areas 9 and 12, and what's left of 10 and 13, others just like us and just like Kusakabe are preparing to unwind 17 years of Britannian conquest. An old man's stubbornness or not, princess, and now Taizo was leaning forwards, detachment vanished from his eyes, as he spoke to her not as Kaguya or as Lady Kaguya, but as the last sprout on the great tree of Yamato. This has gone beyond you and beyond me now. One way or another, someone, probably Colonel Kusakabe, no need to beat around the bush now, will fire the first shots against Britannia, with or without us. Past that point, the cycle of escalation and retaliation will continue, until either they or we are all deceased. Our choice now isn't whether or not we should start the general uprising, but whether we shall ride this wild horse or be trampled below its hooves. You still haven't answered my question, Lord Taizo, and I don't believe for a moment that you are throwing some long-prepared plan into action, Kaguya doggedly replied, fire replaced by a certainty just as firm as her mentor's, still glaring down at the old man as she tried to ignore how pointlessly academic this conversation suddenly rang in her ears. You have simply attempted to shift responsibility for the actions you clearly intend to take away from yourself and onto the inevitability of history. So be it. If the uprising must happen, then surely there must be a plan for the aftermath. If this uprising you forecast succeeds, if the sun rises on a Japan again, what comes next? Surely you have an answer. The silent addition was near begging. You have always had an answer, have always articulated the importance of deliberate action. Surely, Taizo, you won't prove a hypocrite now, at this latest juncture? I am sorry that you find my answer inadequate, Lady Kaguya, Kirihara Taizo said, leaning back in his armchair once more as his fervency again cooled to the same resigned detachment as before. I hope that you will understand my intentions once the heat of the rising sun again graces your face in a liberated Japan. Now, and he was looking down at her again somehow, for all that she stood tall upon her own 2 feet, will I have the cooperation of the Sumeragi clan in this undertaking, when I go to meet with the other clan heads in half an hour? Or will I have to begin this great undertaking alone? At last, Kaguya heard something familiar in Taizo's voice, something that belonged to the shrewd old man, the pillar of her childhood and the foundation of Kyoto House. It was the language of negotiation, of the forging of clauses and the establishment of contracts. Meat and rice to Kirihara Taizo. And the milk she had grown up upon. Oh? Kaguya angled her head inquisitively, merchant instincts coming to the fore through the emotional turmoil. What can the House of Sumeragi offer the great master of Kirihara? I thought you were already resolved to your plan, or at least to whatever shambles you've thrown together. Lord Tosei and Lord Tatsunori are a spent force, Taizo said bluntly. Neither is in any position to push back against anything I should propose, not with the House of Munakata losing all leverage over the functional portion of the JLF's leadership and the severe damage its finances sustained during the Christmas incident, and not with how hollowed out the House of Asakabe has become. I hold both seats in the palm of my hand. Lords Yoshino and Kubuin are a different matter. While Central and Southern Honshu might dance more or less to my tune, Lord Kubuin has an iron hold on the north, and on Wakayama and Nara. The hidden shrines and the militant brotherhoods both adore him. And they both hate me. Lord Yoshino married a southerner, and she's delivered Kyushu and Shikoku into his hands. Kagaya nodded along, sinking as best as she could into the familiarity of the exchange. The names and facts were nothing new, nothing she hadn't heard before in so many other meetings in this study, where she and Taizo had planned out their strategy for upcoming general meetings with the other heads of the 6 houses. The House of Hidenobu and the House of Hayoshi could provide formidable stumbling blocks for a general, Japan-wide uprising on their own, Taizo continued, gesturing broadly over his lukewarm coffee. If Lord Yoshino holds himself aloof, not only does that mean the Britannians could plausibly withdraw to form a redoubt on the southern home islands, but that the Kagoshima settlement will remain unscathed and the Fukuoka and Kitakyushu naval bases will remain in Britannian hands. That would sound the death knell for a reborn Japan, just as much if Hokkaido, Aomori, Sendai, and everything south of Osaka remain in Britannian hands, because Lord Kubuin was unable to convince his supporters to follow my plan. This uprising must include all of Japan, or it is doomed. We must all hang together, lest we hang singly, Kagaya replied in Britannian, quoting from her lessons about Washington's rebellion. She idly wondered who among Kyoto would play the role of Franklin, the Judas. Though in a way she supposed they were all traitors, to one master or another. How do you propose the House of Samaragi assist you with your goal to set all of Japan ablaze, Lord Taizo? Unfortunately, I lack a southern wife. True, but you bear the imperial bloodline, Taizo retorted, his gaze knowing as Kagaya felt a familiar creeping discomfort at the mention. Whoever you marry will be the next emperor, when the time comes, and his children will be of the blood. While that might not matter so much in Nagoya or Yokohama or Tokyo, it still matters a great deal to the peasants working in the fields of noble estates. And it matters even more to those following the path of the gods in Wakayama and in parts north of Fukushima. With your approval, the House of Hidenobu will have to follow me or lose control over at least some of their followers. It didn't take long for the gears to click into place in her mind. And with Hidenobu, Munakata, Osakabe, and Samaragi at your back, the House of Hayoshi will have no choice but to join in your effort, lest they either fall to our own knives or those of the Britannians, Kagaya concluded. As she tested the weight of the idea in her own head, she had to admit that there was some merit to Taizo's hastily thrown-together plan. Denying the Britannians a safe staging ground for any reconquest was still putting the cart before the horse to a degree, but it indicated at least some thought beyond the immediate push to dislodge the Britannians from their settlements. Of course, the plan still rested on the massive assumption that the foreign invaders would even bother with such niceties instead of simply slagging every square inch of the home islands. So, Kagaya thought, I do have some measure of power here after all, in spite of all of his efforts to render me a helplessly passive observer to the unfolding of my own fate. He could take his own assets and whatever he salvaged from Munakata and Osakabe up in his hands and throw them at the Britannians, but to have even the slightest hope of success, he needs my backup. Of course, she noted, he seems determined to advance his plan and is already resigned to die, so if I back out he will still drag us all down. I doubt I can truly stop this mad gambit of his, but perhaps I can wrangle out some concessions before I truly bind myself to this ride to damnation. An interesting proposition, Lord Taizo. The word sounded alien, almost like birdsong. The familiar melody of hemming and hawing over details here and obligations there. So small in this moment, but still the fulcrum around which everything else swung. What are you prepared to offer in exchange for the full and public support of the House of Samaragi? The throne. Kagaya blinked. Did I hear him correctly? He would back my enthronement in my own right, Not just the enthronement of my husband-to-be? Not since 1771 has Japan been ruled by a woman. Coming from Taizo, never one to promote equality between the sexes. It's a shocking offer. The throne? She asked, probing for confirmation. Didn't the Britannians destroy it? Yes, Taizo admitted, grimacing. Takamakura and Mikodai both burned, and soldiers scrapped the gold for themselves. But, I offer you the chrysanthemum throne, princess, and not just in name, nor as a cipher for your eventual husband. When I die, I will die without an heir. Should I predecease you, all of my wealth and all of my power will be yours, along with your own formidable holdings. I cannot guarantee the loyalty of all who serve me and take my money, but you will have that money to buy soldiers of your own. I said that I would see the sun rise on Japan, but I see no reason to resurrect the pretense of the Republic, sham that it was. When we drive out the Holy Empire, Princess, join me in returning Japan to the true way, to the proper way. A throne? Kagaya could have laughed, but there was nothing remotely funny about the seriousness of the situation. But still, he thinks he can buy me with a throne. What, in the name of all gods great and small, is the point of a throne if the cost is my nation's future? Taizo, you have all but told me to my face that you mean to see the Japan of your memories come again, even if it takes a mountain of bodies to buy that momentary glimpse. But seeing a country, her country, its desolation outlined in the unyielding plains of Taizo's face, Kagaya knew that nothing she could say would turn back the old man now. After years of bowing to Britannians, Lord Taizo had succumbed to a moment of hope, and now he was caught in that cruel vice. In a way, she considered, searching that faded face, so familiar and yet a stranger still, I can sympathize. All of this last desperate gamble. This is Lord Taizo's suicide, extended out across the land he has guided for the better part of a century. An entire country turned into a pyre. And now, he has handed me a candle of my own and asked if I would care to join him atop the bonfire, an empress of the dead. A horrid image passed before Kagaya's eyes, of sitting in Taizo's private office atop the Mount Fuji mining complex, sharing a last drink while, far below, Tokyo drowned in a tsunami of fire and steel. But this represents an opportunity as well, Kagaya told herself, shoving the sight of fire and the taste of fine sake away. Not so much with the rest of Kyoto House, for all their jockeying and factional games, they are Taizo's equals in their fixation on the past and on their own fates, but for all those that Kyoto House shall trot me out before. I've always resented my blood, resented how my heritage always outweighed anything that I could ever be or do of my own ability, but if I can fashion it into some rope to pull my nation away from the edge, from self-immolating in their millions. He may not see a road mapped out to secure Japan after the uprising, but that does not mean such a path does not exist. Revere the Empress, Kagaya said in a voice that she didn't recognize as her own, that she didn't recognize as Sophie Samaragi's, even. Expel the barbarians. By your will, my Empress, Taizo affirmed in a voice that reeked of the same gloating satisfaction as she had heard earlier in his meanderings regarding the Duke of Vancouver. I summoned the other heads before you arrived, they should already be waiting for us, down in the dining room. Let us not keep them waiting for us any longer. August 11, 2016 ATB. Council of Notables, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 0930. Leaders of Shinjuku, luminaries of the chamber. Behind the lectern in the center of the former middle school gymnasium, I raised my hands in greeting. Salutations to you all. Thank you for heeding my call and attending this emergency meeting. Irritatingly, my audience was far from silent. Murmurs swept in swirling eddies across the seated men, and they were almost all men, and most well above the average age in Shinjuku to boot, as members of the Council of Notables conferred with one another and their aides. The full council was in attendance, or as near to its 100-head strong muster as could be scraped together at 2 hours' notice. Supplementing the assembly was nearly 3 times their number in assorted hangers-on, all packed into the reclaimed shell of the old Shinjuku Junior High School. Pushing past my annoyance at being disrespected again by these useless old men, I continued on with my speech. After all, I consoled myself, This could very well be the last opportunity they will ever have to ignore me. I am sure most of you have heard the wonderful news from Indochina, I said, knowing full well that everybody present had eagerly devoured any scrap of information they could discover, myself very much included, but I will relay it now for any who have not been so blessed. Rejoice! I called, hands rising even higher into the air, as if I was reaching for the sun itself. Britannia has suffered a grievous defeat. Bogged down under mud and inept leadership, the invaders have squandered an entire field army. The armies of the Chinese Federation yesterday butchered 2 entire divisions of infantry and a full brigade of nightmares at a place called Near Lo. Cheers rose from the crowd along with a crashing wave of applause, which I contributed to gladly, making a point of keeping my clapping hands in full view of the crowd, reinforcing this moment of harmony. Though our interests diverged in many ways, everybody in the room benefited from the death of Britannians and the ruin of their formations. Yes, I declared as the cheers began to die down, calling on just a hint of my magic to lift my voice over the raucous din, the so-called Holy Empire has experienced a cataclysmic defeat in the Chinese jungles. Even now, Britannians from the soldiers in their barracks to the murderer called Clovis in his throne room tremble, imagining the fate that has befallen their brothers in arms. Another cheer rose, this one harder edged. It was a joyous sound still, but in it I could hear the baying of hounds, ready to leap for the bear's throat now that the scent of blood had filled their nostrils. Time to rein the pack in. Many people across Japan, and across the other nations enslaved by Britannia, will see this weakness and decide that now is the time to strike. That now is the hour long awaited for, come at last. And now there was silence, or the closest thing to it the frankly awful acoustics of the old gym could manage. A sea of keen-eyed faces gazed back at me, watching my every move, assessing my every gesture and weighing every pause. This, I drew out the moment, is not so. Clamor rose from the audience as, indignant, men began rising to their feet, yelling over one another. Eyes fired with passion, faces red with anger at the denial of the nectar, so close they could almost smell it, filled my vision. Behind me, even over the cacophony, I could hear the faint sounds of my bodyguards tightening their grip on their rifles. Standing directly at my back, I heard Nagata swallow hard and could imagine the way my old comrade, the only other person in this room who had been with me in that first basement hideout so long ago now, was picturing his wife and child, wishing he was back home with them instead of facing down the mob of the petulant fools I had humored for so long. Be silent. I boomed, drawing on my magic in earnest this time to effortlessly overwhelm the useless noise. Pretend, at least, to possess the dignity worthy of being called notable among the long-suffering people of Shinjuku. What the hell do you think you're doing, Hajime? That lone voice, refusing to knuckle under, came from one of the few men still on his feet. Nishizumi Tsutsumi, counselor for Central Kamiakiai, stood, fists at his side, glaring balefully at me and, I realized, at Nagata standing behind me. Britannia will never be weaker than it is today. Counselor Nishizumi proclaimed, his voice, roughened by years spent bellowing orders at sailors and honed by guiding the gangsters he had commanded through the brutal turf wars of Shinjuku, carrying throughout the so-called Chamber of Notables wherein the Council of Notables met with equal ease as my own. We should kick them now, while they're hurt and bleeding. That army was their fist, not only for Indochina but for any uprising here in Japan. That army is gone, which means we have a chance. Do we? I demanded, my eyes narrowing as I glared at my old enemy. That he was my enemy, I had no doubt of. First he had tried to undermine the structure of my organization, both by casting aspersions on the character of Nagata, my chosen agent, and then by attempting to swindle extra supplies for his constituency at the expense of the rest. Then, he had made a public show of reconciliation in the wake of the Yokohama massacre, throwing all responsibility onto my back and washing his hands of the hard work of governing in a crisis, and ever since I took over for Naoto, he's been part of the clique muttering against me, I knew. Always saying that I was weak, that I was foolish, that I was disloyal. That I was a whore's daughter, a Britannian in all but language, a stupid girl who should have known her place. My enemy, offering himself up for special attention at last. "And what would you say we should do, Counselor for Central Kamiaki?" I continued, leaning forwards over the lectern and pretending I wasn't standing on a wobbly box to achieve the height necessary for such a maneuver. "Should we throw ourselves into the teeth of the Tokyo garrison, slaughtering as many Britannians and honoraries as we can before reinforcements converge and crush us all, squandering the work of months in hours? Perhaps we should push a grenade into the hands of every child with the strength requisite to pull the pin and direct them to find a Britannian, any Britannian, to take with them into the afterlife." "And what would you have us do, O great Commander Hajime?" came the sarcastic reply. "Cower and die in our homes? Piss on this last chance to breathe free Japanese air so we can choke on Britannian smog in a month?" Frustratingly, the crowd of notables and lackeys murmured approvingly at his rejoinder. It was the response most of those present would have given, I knew, just as readily as Nishizumi had given it. The answer of old men who rest content that, when the Britannian hammer comes down, they will be among the last to die, I thought, sneering from behind my mask of command at the whole flock of carrion eaters. Fortunately for the people of Shinjuku, they will not have the chance to enjoy such a luxury. I would give the people of Shinjuku a hope to see a month from today, rather than die within the week, I replied curtly, allowing a small measure of my contempt to leak out. Make no mistake, honored notables, the Britannians will be coming to Shinjuku. One way or another, that much is inevitable. The question is whether we are prepared to wage the long war I have been preparing this entire city for, or if through hot-blooded foolishness the work of months as well as any tactical advantage will be offered up in blood sacrifice for a mere double handful of Britannian corpses. If the Britannians are coming to Shinjuku no matter what we do, one of the other notables chimed in, rising to his feet, it would be better if we were to choose the time of their arrival. If we send out a few small forces to attack the barracks and neighborhoods nearest the gates of the ghetto before retreating back within the walls, and mark ourselves out for special attention once the Britannians recover their wits and start attacking anything that makes them say boo, it was enough to bring me to tears. All of these fools had no idea what they were talking about, had no idea what war was like, truly like. Before the conquest, Japan hadn't gone to war in 2 generations, and the conquest itself had lasted a month. The Britannians had barely broken a sweat seizing the Republic of Japan. None of them had seen what I had seen in a different life, in a different world. None of them had done what I had done, had watched as massed artillery devastated the very land and killed entire cities. Nobody here knew war. Nobody but me. It has to be this way. Now hear this. I raised a hand again, but not in greeting. Behind me, the line of soldiers from the Internal Affairs Force in their blue sashes and Sun Guard Hachimaki took a step forward, still Safed rifles at present arms before their chests. The room again grew silent. It was, I reflected, ironic that yet another turning point in my life would unfold here, in this building. While the structure had once been the Shinjuku Junior High School, before it had become the meeting chamber of the Council of Notables, it had housed the Shinjuku School for 11s, an institution I had so briefly attended. It had been in that school, where Britannian instructors dispatched by the area administration worked to convert Japanese children into dutiful honoraries, that I had learned I would never have the chance to work within the Britannian system towards anything I would consider success. A path to a potentially peaceful life stymied before it could even begin, all due to discriminatory fiat. In a way, I suppose it was in this old school hall that I became truly Japanese once again, before Naoto and Ogi ever met me. It was a bitter thought. I had been forced onto this path of rebellion, of fighting against the state and against institutional power in favor of a chaos I could only barely control at the best of times. While I was far past the point of turning back now, I still couldn't help but wonder at the counterfactuals. If I had succeeded in becoming an honorary, could I have made something of myself, that teachers candor be damned? Turned my Britannian features into an asset, rather than a constant burden? Would my mother, hanging on my coattails as I left the ghetto to find a place in the honorary neighborhoods of the outer settlement, still be alive today? That was a truly bitter thought. As was the knowledge that, even though I had considered myself as Japanese both before and after that pivotal moment, my blonde hair and blue eyes had always marked me out as an interloper among my own, just as much as Callan's own crimson hair announced her own Britannian heritage. I'd had to work so hard to stay alive in the long hungry years in the streets, struggling for every calorie I could find, the usual leniency shown to children gone when the people saw the face of an enemy among them. Even after I had proven myself, the likes of Major Onoda and Councillor Nishizumi had still looked down upon me for reasons as nonsensical as blood and birth, in Onoda's case not even deigning to speak to me directly when we had first met. Never again. By my authority as a triumvirate of the Kozuki organization, by my rank as a commander of the Sun Guard, by my works as the founder of the Rising Sun Benevolent Association, and by the oath sworn by every living person who bears arms in Shinjuku, I declare a state of emergency. All Sun Guard units are now placed under the direct command of my appointed officers, my leadership commission, and myself. All resources stored within Rising Sun depots or distributed from that same organization's kitchens are now requisitioned by the same to preserve the common good in the face of such overwhelming catastrophe. This chamber, and I tried hard not to smile, and mostly succeeded, is hereby declared dissolved for the duration of the emergency, as is the Council of Notables. Should any of your advice be required, citizens of Shinjuku, it was a joy to no longer require myself to honor the silly title Naoto had granted them. I shall seek you out to ask for it. They hungered for war with Britannia? Fine. I would give them all the war they could stomach, starting with a stiff and long-delayed serving of martial law. May they choke on it. Though my feet were firmly on the ground, or at least an old tinned beef crate, I felt like I was flying as the burdens of long days and sleepless nights fell away. Like the king of old, I had cut through the Gordian knot of my domestic problems. There would be issues, of course. There were always issues. Judging by the mounting volume of voices as more and more of the former notables rose to their feet, the issues were already beginning to arise. Fortunately, I had planned for such an eventuality, or at least, prepared. Planned was such a strong word, especially since I had thrown all of this together over a sleepless night, determined to steal a march on the council before their clear inadequacy doomed us all. Already, agents and officers from the IAF and other trusted squads of Sun Guards were fanning out across Shinjuku to announce the new orders and to begin distributing new work assignments to the units most tightly enmeshed in the patronage of various notables. There would be plenty of work to do, starting with the dispersal of the angry crowd that was quickly descending into an enraged mob. Plenty of tunnels would have to be dug, deeper under Shinjuku and fanning out in all directions headed away from the settlement's core. New ratlines, new escape routes, new bunkers and new spider holes, dug from the old mud of Kanto's plain. Stocks of supplies and munitions needed to be consolidated and reportioned to subterranean caches across the breadth of Shinjuku. Keen-eyed watchers had to be assigned to the observer posts keeping a wary watch over the gates into Shinjuku, and 1,000 other tiny things had to be handled in preparation for the inevitable attack. Nagata was leading me away, I noticed, calloused hands on my shoulders as he guided me, in the middle of a knot of armed men in blue sashes, towards the door out of the hall. Take her to Inno's office, I heard him say, Ogi and Naoto's old friend, the ever-reliable designated driver of our organization. Get her there now, and send reinforcements. We'll hold them here. Ah, yes, Inno. How could I have forgotten to include Inno in my plan? It was all moving so fast, now that the balloon had well and truly gone up. At the center of my web, I had been kept busy, so busy, keeping all the wheels greased and the gears turning. Some things had slipped while I was busy, it was clear. Like sleep, or informing Inno of what I was doing. Yes, I decided as Nagata turned his back, the gymnasium doors closing between him and me, going to Inno's would be a fine idea. She's the quartermaster, so her office will be the best place to coordinate the newly centralized administration of the free city of Shinjuku. No more need to listen to any carping from any of the old bastards Naoto picked to mismanage their little slices of Shinjuku. My city, finally, at last. At last, I thought dreamily, my enhancements hiccuping, At last we will be free. Ah, nostalgia, I vaguely thought, my mind flitting back to the first time I'd found myself visiting Ino's former den, on a quest for information about the underground Shinjuku economy. She forced me to eat that time too, I recalled, and it was probably soup then too. Experimentally, I raised a heavily laden spoon to my mouth, blew on it, and took it in. The soup was warm and thick, vegetable broth full of barley and vegetables and scraps of meat. Delicious and nourishing. So, Ino said from the other side of the narrow table I had once sat down with her and Naoto at, breaking the tense silence that had filled the narrow office since my IAF bodyguard deposited me here with a quick muttered explanation of the meeting's events in Ino's ear. Care to tell me what you were thinking, Tanya? Because I'm frankly at a loss here. I thought you didn't want to be the sole source of authority? The one everybody was depending on? I don't, I grumbled, spooning up another bite. But that's happened anyway. I just formalized what was already the case. Perhaps, Ino allowed, folding her arms across her chest. Keep eating, she snapped as I made to put my spoon down. Don't take my demand that you explain yourself as an excuse to escape a meal. You can eat while you talk. Fine, I acquiesced, taking another bite of my soup. It was quite tasty. How long has it been since I last ate? I tried to recall. I think Chika forced me to eat a roll for breakfast. So? Ino prodded. So, I didn't want it to come to this, but I couldn't let those idiots just throw everything away, I answered, taking another bite as Ino looked expectantly at me. I knew they would be eager to strike at Britannia, understandably so, but I couldn't allow them to take our forces out from behind prepared fortifications just to launch an impulsive assault without achievable objectives. That would be insanity. I can see that, Ino nodded thoughtfully, but surely you could have waited until they actually proposed that plan? And I am certain you could have delivered that message in a less confrontational manner. Perhaps if you had explained your concerns, they would have listened. They would not, I flatly denied, fingers tightening around my spoon. I know them, Ino. Not individually, and not really as people, but I know their kind. Stubborn, ignorant, proud old fools. That Nishizumi of all people would be the one to stand up and say what they were all thinking demonstrates their collective intelligence. But, you are correct, I conceded, frowning. I should have let them put their foot into the trap before I pulled them back, but between the raw stupidity of it all, the fact that I knew that, stupid or not, most of the idiots would love it, and the way that I know that some of them, despite everything, still see me as a Britannian because of my blood. I shrugged, staring into my soup. I couldn't trust them to see the sense of it. I couldn't trust them to back down if I didn't force them to submit immediately. Done is done. Tell me more about your plan for the defense now, said Ino, smoothly switching topics. Based on what your man reported, it doesn't sound like you're very optimistic about our chances when the hammer finally falls. How do I answer a question like that? I wondered, taking another bite to buy time. Defeatism is unacceptable. But I am very confident in our ability to ward off the Britannians, at least initially, should they roll into Shinjuku like they did Yokohama, I explained, gesturing with my spoon. Based on the reports Junji's assembled from eyewitness testimony, the Britannian reprisal in Yokohama was conducted by perhaps a brigade's worth of infantry backed by a few squads of nightmares and a few special elements. My mouth twisted at the mention of this last group. That was, apparently, the euphemism used to describe the army detachments who collected and processed prisoners. Perhaps a better name for them would be the Slava Corps or similar. All told, I went on, just about 5,000 soldiers equipped with small arms and backed up by a handful of armored cars and nightmares, plus a sufficiency of trucks. If that's what they send to pry us out of Shinjuku, we will slaughter them. Anti-armor missiles, mines, snipers, machine gun nests, as soon as they entered the kill zone, they'd be finished. So what happens after that? I retorted, trading Ino a question for a question. What happens next? In all likelihood, and considering how the Britannian forces in Japan have operated to date, they'll send in a significant force of nightmares. While we will have lost the element of surprise, this still wouldn't concern me overly much. We could handle it. But then what happens once we handle that, once we prove ourselves a legitimate threat? They'll deploy the artillery. This time, I hadn't needed Inno's prompting to answer my own question. The nightmare can be quite dangerous in urban areas, I'm sure of that. The sheer utility of the /Harkons is enough to convince me of that, along with the formidable amount of firepower any nightmare can bring to bear. But while nightmares can be made to operate in cities, artillery is specialized in killing cities. And once whichever idiot Britannian is placed in command of the initial efforts gets punted, and once someone serious is put in charge, well. My mind was again in Irene as I spoke, and in faded memories 2 lifetimes old. Memories of black and white pictures of destruction in history books, and memories of news anchors talking about cities with names like Grozny and Sarajevo. They will shell us into submission, Inno, I said, fingers tight on my bowl and my spoon. Grid square by grid square, they'll hammer us until the rubble bounces. Then they'll send in light infantry to scout the remains, and any time they find anybody still alive they'll pull back and shell the place again. When they find the entrances to our tunnels, our basements, and our bunkers, they'll throw poison gas down into our holes. Even if we don't die from the poison, any food and water not stored in airtight containers would be contaminated, so we'd get the choice of starving below or being shot above ground. Our only reprieve would be the sheer size of the mountain of shells destroying Shinjuku utterly would require. But even that only means that any commander with half a brain will keep us bottled up until their next munition ship or whatever arrives in Tokyo Bay. A ship loaded with 50,000 shells would be the sure death of everybody here. By the time the guns fell silent for lack of ammunition, there would be nothing left of Shinjuku. How do you know this? Inno asked, brow furrowed as she stared at me. That wasn't what the conquest was like at all. It's not like the conquest is the only war humanity has ever waged in the modern age. Certainly not the only one Britannia has launched, I pointed out, still staring into the dregs of my soup. My appetite had fled me once again. The conquest was merely an explosion of overwhelming power against a criminally underprepared foreign state. A state that collapsed almost as soon as the fighting started. In comparison, an operation conducted against us in earnest would be the quashing of a fully prepared and organized rebellion whose members are willing to fight to the death. In such affairs, nobody can afford half measures. Besides, if I had to pry a determined organization such as ours out from an urban environment and I cared neither for the population nor the mess I would create, this is how I would go about things. All right, Inno nodded. She still looked dubious, but mercifully she didn't press further. So, why not attack the Britannians now, if that's what will happen if we turtle up? In fact, why bother trying to defend Shinjuku at all? Why not just abandon it? Abandon Shinjuku. My mind reeled at the prospect as my eyes snapped up from my soup bowl to meet Inno's questioning gaze. Leaving behind the memories of years of pain and deprivation, the memories of a slow death of a people. Of my mother. Leaving behind all of the hard work, of watching hope dawn in eyes and fat beginning to plump out gaunt cheeks. Instinctually, I rebelled at the idea. Shinjuku is mine. My home, my territory. How dare the Britannians try to push me out? How dare Nishizumi deny me its mastery? I have taken it and remade it as best as I could in the image I saw for it. How dare they? How? I asked, half indignant, and immediately went on the offensive as I ignored the ridiculous feelings bubbling in my heart. We've already been doing our best to smuggle people out, sometimes hundreds at a time, but we still have 200,000 people here. 1/5 of a million. If we all tried to leave at once, it would be chaos. How would we provide transportation? Where would we even go once we found the means of conveyance? A flow of hundreds at a time can be distributed across the emptied spaces of rural Japan without serious economic dislocation or privation. 200,000, though? Starvation would walk in our shoes. We'd die on our feet before we ever made it to safety. Besides, How could we escape the Britannians' notice? They would just follow us wherever we ran or would kill us on the open road, if they didn't just shell us on our way out. Hopefully that's enough to satisfy her. As for just attacking the settlement haphazardly and inflicting what damage we can. I shook my head, my eyes slumping back towards the cold dregs, the sudden spike of passion exhausted. I don't even know where to begin with the errors in that. Why throw away the element of surprise at a time like this? Why mark ourselves out for special attention once the Britannians finally get around to taking their vengeance? What could we hope to achieve with our makeshift bombs and small arms before the defenses of the viceregal palace crushed us into the dirt? So, that's it, then? Ino and I both jumped slightly in our seats, turning to look where the voice had come from. There, sitting in a previously empty corner of Ino's office, Chika sat cross-legged on the ground, staring up at us through the round discs of her spectacles. If we stay here, the girl, my aide, said, her voice flat, we die. If we leave, we die. If we attack, we die. If we defend, we die. Yes, I answered, succinctly but not curtly. Most of us, at least. I plan on accelerating evacuation efforts as best I can until the last hour, and to drag the defense out for as long as possible to buy more time for people to sneak away and vanish into the countryside. Shinjuku will die. But it won't die quietly. Its death throes should be more than loud enough to distract Britannia from refugees escaping into the night. I paused, then added, in as gentle of a voice as I could manage, would you like a place in the next group out, Chika? If you want to go. That's fine with me. Rising, the sister of the Yokohama sniper crossed the office and sat down in the empty stool by my side. Not until you go, Tanaka Chika replied, the smile on her face a ghost of the happy girl I had first met, before her sister had left her to find her destiny. Until you leave Shinjuku, there will be hope. And where there is hope, there is a chance. I couldn't find it in myself to point out her folly. August 11, 2016 ATB. Apartment above Student Council Clubhouse, Ashford Academy. 1100. Out of love for the truth and from a soul-felt desire to break the scales that over the eyes of the chosen people, Lelouch wrote, his ballpoint scratching over the yellow pages of the legal pad, I, Father Alexander of the Holy and True Anglican Church, shall administer correction to the whore who garbs herself in the name and mitre of the Church of Britannia, both in the destruction of the corrupt bishops who labour in her service and in the following attack upon her fallacious and heretical doctrine. I wonder if this is how Martin Luther felt, Lelouch wondered as he stared down at the expanse of the paper before him, hungrily awaiting the caress of his pen. Perhaps I should emulate him and send the congregants out with hammers and nails. It would certainly be a rather direct delivery, and without any need for the post office to facilitate either. Point the first, the man Charles, and Lelouch permitted himself a small smirk at the petty joy of describing that man as such, of late styled the Emperor of Britannia, is not God. This should be self-evident, as no man can be God, save only for the carpenter, whose nature as both holy man and wholly divine is the cornerstone of our faith. The Britannic Church claims that upon his coronation at the hands of his chosen Archbishop of Rochester, the man Charles ascended both to the throne of Britannia and to the throne of God on earth. Not only is that second institution a sign of creeping popery within the rotting edifice of the Britannic Church, but such a transformation equates the renowned deviant and predator Warren of Tucson with the Baptist and even more ill-fittingly, Charles with the carpenter. This is clear blasphemy of the highest degree. Point the second, just as the true Church is the bride of the true God and no other, so too can one man be the spouse of one and no other. In the past, limited exceptions were made in times of great distress and to those whose lives rested entirely in the hands of Almighty God. That is wholly divorced from the lustful doctrine of polygamy devised by Warren of Tucson to justify his unholy craving for the flesh of the wives and daughters of other men, and embraced by the man Charles during his campaigns to secure his blood-tarnished crown. Indeed, it is entirely antithetical to the very spirit of God and heresy to the true Anglican Church. Which would presumably make Nunnally and I bastards, what with Mother being the 100th woman he chose to marry. Lelouch gave an internal shrug. Compared to everything else he had to worry about, possibly attainting himself as a bastard was far from the top of his list of concerns. If anything, the illegitimacy would be a slight but welcome degree of separation between himself and Nunnally and that man. Point the third, Lelouch began, frowning slightly as he began writing the blatant and distasteful yet necessary falsehood: the Britannians are beloved by God and are his chosen people, their royal line declared defenders of the faith by the papacy before that institution fell into unrighteousness and European decadence. The Church is meant to serve the needs of that chosen people, and should be the first, last, and eternal refuge of every Britannian in need of succor and aid. That the state church is overrun by thieves and embezzlers, con men and swindlers, whoremongers and slavers, is emblematic of the fall from grace and reflects the withdrawal of God's grace from the church who claims to act in his name. Point the fourth. Hello, brother. Swiveling around in his office chair, Lelouch smiled as his sister rolled through the doorway connecting his bedroom to the rest of their apartment. Beside her, the ever-faithful Shinazaki Sayoko stood in the shadow of his little sister's chair, hands meekly folded over her white apron. To Lelouch's approval, the Japanese woman's eyes were active and roving the corners of his room, checking for assailants even here, in the heart of the Lamperouge siblings' private sanctuary. Commendable in her diligence and ever faithful, what else could one ask for from a servant? Ever faithful at least, so long as I remain in congruence with the interests of the Ashfords, thought Lelouch, chiding himself for the momentary lapse as he met the maid's restless eyes with a slight acknowledging nod before refocusing his attention on his sister. She was Millie's sworn servant first, after all, and her loyalty to Ryuban in particular is obvious. So long as I keep the Ashfords close and tend to their interests, she should have no reason to betray Nunnally and I. Although, at this point any plans on my part to intentionally betray the Ashfords may as well include gouging out my own eyes, for all the good they'll do me, Lelouch admitted. One way or another, I have bound my fate to their own, and it is entirely too late for me to think about double-crossing them now. Especially not when Millie has proven herself such a capable partner in rebellion? Revolution? Crime? Let's just say a capable partner and leave it at that. Good morning, Nunnally, Lelouch said, greeting his sister with a smile he knew she could hear in his voice. How goes your morning? How was class? Saying it was educational would be something of a stretch, his angelic little sister opined, her face twisting into a frown. All anybody, Mrs. Swain included, could talk about was the news from Area 10. All of the asides and exclamations from people looking at their phones made focusing on Chaucer quite difficult. Perhaps I should bring this up with Millie? Lelouch muttered darkly, frowning in consternation at this report of poor performance from the staff. Tuition at Ashford was quite expensive and instructors were well compensated, so there really was no excuse. No matter the distraction, such a performance is unacceptable. In fact, he turned to glance at the waiting maid. Sayoko, would you mind finding Millie for me and asking if she would care to join us for lunch? Certainly, Master Lelouch, the maid murmured, bowing low. The door closed behind her with a light click. No matter the distraction? Nunnally asked, resuming the thread of their conversation as she leaned forward in her chair, her eyebrows elevated though the lids remained closed over her eyes. She was, Lelouch realized, clearly mimicking some inquisitorial authority, leaning forward to peer dubiously at a subject. I wonder if she is imitating some memory of mother. Tell me, brother, have you turned on a TV today? I scarcely think distraction is the best word to describe the pandemonium. Oh, yes, he waved off her incredulity with a laugh. I know what the distraction is, rest assured of that. Momentous or otherwise, it remains irrelevant to this circumstance. You deserve the best education money can buy, Nunnally. Something, I assure you, that Ryuban and I have invested no small amount of money and resources into. If Britannia can't handle suffering its gravest defeat at the hands of a foreign enemy since the days of the Little Corporal, then perhaps they should stop sticking their hands into beehives, Then surely you must already be scheming how best to exploit that great defeat, since you already know of it, Nunnally persisted, unwilling to be put off by his humor. Come, brother, Out with it. What's going through your head? Oh, very well. He truly could never deny his sister a thing. Besides, her interest in his thoughts was gratifying. Bringing her in on his plans had truly been a wise move. Besides, Lelouch thought, feeling a worm of guilt squirming in his breast, Nunnally hates being left out, and I was going to tell her anyway, once I came to a decision. Perhaps she can assist me in choosing my next step. To say that the cock-up in Indochina is a significant development would be underselling matters. This is, Lelouch sighed, leaning back in his chair as he tried to put his feelings into words. Unprecedented, he decided at last. In the truest sense, at least in this century. Even during the Emblem of Blood, the army and navy had little trouble fighting against non-Britannian enemies despite laboring under at times conflicting orders and a fractured home front. Admittedly, the struggles in the North Atlantic and South Pacific played to the Navy's strengths, and the attempted uprisings in South America were hilariously poorly organized for all their scope, so it was hardly a case of dire straits for the armed services. Regardless, the illusion of Britannian supremacy remained fully intact, even as the succession conflicts raged. Well, it isn't quite the humiliation of Edinburgh again, but it might well be the closest thing to it. I can only imagine the flurry of activity that must have ensued in Nanjing and Paris when the news arrived. I wonder if even the eunuchs anticipated their field marshal's success. Perhaps the news came as great a surprise to them as it must have come to Schniesel. And speaking of Schniesel, what the hell was he doing, allowing something like this to happen? Was being a renowned politician not enough for him, so he chose to play his hand at generalship as well? Every enemy Britannia possesses will jump at this, Lelouch prophesied, closing his eyes and lifting his chin as he tried to imagine all of the dominoes across the world the defeat might send sprawling. While the forces lost a paltry compared to the full might of the armed services, the material element will matter less in the next few days than the perception of disarray in Britannia's projects. Besides, Lelouch continued, nunnily almost forgotten as he allowed his mind the liberty to gallop down this tangent, the armed services and the army in particular are already heavily committed, between Cornelia's expeditionary army in the Middle East, the struggle in Malacca and Malaysia, the garrisons across the Pacific Rim, and the constant need to keep a sufficient home guard to keep the nobles in check. Well, the loss of an infantry corps and an armored brigade is a blow that cannot be shrugged off completely. Especially not here in Area 11, where Clovis is apparently in dire need for nightmare pilots. You expect Brother Clovis to be left incapable of action? Nunnally inquired, Lelouch opening his eyes just in time to watch her head tilt inquisitively to the side. He was already worried about his strength and if the units that could have reinforced him will be filling the holes left by Elphinstone's column. Well, dear Brother Clovis was never the most audacious of men, was he? Certainly not the most far-sighted, Lelouch agreed, nodding his head as his thoughts turned to a blond boy who could never come close to measuring up to brothers his elder or junior. When we played against one another, he tended to veer between overly aggressive maneuvers that cost him badly needed material and overly conservative defensiveness that cost him initiative and time. His time as vice-regal governor has been much of the same. Lelouch opened his eyes to watch as Nunnally raised a finger to her chin where she began to tap it thoughtfully against the corner of her mouth. Poor Brother Clovis, so full of fear. Do you expect him to lash about wildly, or turtle up within his defenses, brother? This from the girl who was enjoying the peaceful imagined beauty of birds building nests together not so long ago. A distant part of Lelouch noted. Is this new, or has she always been so sharp? Both, Lelouch answered firmly, drumming his fingers on the arm of his chair. First the one, then the other. I expect that he will be immediately terrified by the prospect of a seaborne Chinese invasion. It would be Clovis's worst-case scenario, as he would be stuck defending Japan's Saccharide reserves from an assault by a credible peer army and would bear full responsibility for the loss of those reserves, assuming that the Chinese don't immediately attack across the Sea of Japan, which while a possibility I doubt will be their next move, he will attempt to demonstrate how unafraid he is by aggressively attacking any threat within reach. Since the Japanese will certainly be hearing the news, Brother Clovis will likely have no shortage of threats to target, Nunnally noted. And I assume, brother, that will not be the end of his worries? I am not sure I fully agree with you about the Chinese not invading, by the way, but I'm willing to set that to the side for now. How kind of you, Lelouch drawled, smiling at his sister's allowance and the haughty way she had drawn herself up in her chair to deliver it. But yes, he continued, rubbing his hands together, loosening up the incipient cramp that had been just starting to trouble him when Nunnally had distracted him from his writing, I anticipate a very busy few days for Clovis. For a start, Tokyo has a new bishop. Or, at least, a new man to wear the mitre, though he's very much of a sort as the unlamented fattest man in Area 11 was. Unsurprisingly, the church appears just as stubborn as any true Britannian institution to learn from its mistakes. A new bishop? Nunnally raised her eyebrows again, curious. That's a curious first point to jump to when listing Clovis's woes. I would have suspected you would think first of the Japanese and their insurgents. They are also a factor, but I was thinking mostly of how we would be taking advantage of the situation, Lelouch explained, pointedly using the inclusive pronoun as he smiled fondly at his sister. He knew she couldn't see it, but he hoped she could hear it in his voice. That was your question, wasn't it? What I was planning? Well, the new bishop is scarcely better than the last, and already there are mutterings from the commons about him. Plenty of people downloaded and saw the evidence of institutional corruption we provided, and a promotion from within is hardly a sign of any change. And if Clovis is unwilling to provide change, the resulting discontent could mount rapidly. Especially if we help it out and continue to evangelize. How wonderful, brother! A sweet smile, innocently gleeful, happily spread across Nunnally's lips. When will we be striking this new bishop down? Killing Pulsed yielded significant dividends for your church, after all. Proving that you can replicate your achievement will surely undermine Brother Clovis's administration even more. Blinking, Lelouch started and shot a disbelieving glance at his sister, who smiled happily at him from where she sat in her plushly appointed wheelchair. How quickly she jumps to murder! Lelouch marveled, shaking his head incredulously. That man was such a fool, to throw her away just because she was broken. If only he had been wise enough to see her for who she is. You are probably correct, dear sister, Lelouch agreed, settling back down, but I am certain that both Clovis and the newly raised Bishop of Tokyo are equally aware of that particular threat. Security around the cathedral and the bishop's palace will certainly have been tightened since Havelock's last visit. Besides, if the church can replace a corrupt bishop with a successor indistinguishable from his predecessor in such a short time, taking another head seems a bit pointless. Instead, I was planning a strike against the body of the snake itself. The body? Nunnally angled her head, looking almost avian in her scanning curiosity. Perhaps a hawk, ready to stoop. Are you going to begin butchering the parish priests and their decadent deacons? They would certainly be easier targets, I suppose. True, Lelouch agreed again, smothering the momentary pang of disquiet at just how fast his sister was to counter with yet more murder, but I have similar thoughts about the lower ecclesiastical ranks as I do about their superior. No, the real way to strike a blow against both the money-making potential of the church and against its authority as an institution is to destroy the diocesan infrastructure. And by that, I mean burning down the churches. Ah. Nunnally clapped once, her hands coming together in surprise. I see. Yes, I think I see what you're getting at, brother. The church is an institution and derives its authority from remaining a firm and immovable institution. If the people of the Tokyo settlement see all of its properties reduced to ash, their faith in its authority will suffer, and likewise their faith in Clovis. Just so, Lelouch smiled indulgently at his sister's enthusiasm. We can add arson to the list, then, dear sister. That's just about what I was thinking. Plus, since all of the diocese's available funding was oh so recently donated to a range of charities, I imagine they might be facing a bit of a liquidity crisis. Coupled with a potential reduction in tithing from parishioners who just saw every church in Tokyo burn to the ground, the church in Area 11 will have far more issues to worry itself about than assisting Clovis in stabilizing his regime. It will probably be easier to manage a coordinated wave of arsons than culling the priesthood. Nunnally nodded understandingly. Very well, brother, I approve of your plan. You may proceed. Thank you, O grand and glorious leader, Lelouch chuckled, miming a low-seated bow. Your humble subject rejoices in your approval. Ooh, rehearsing for the autumn production, Lulu? Millie asked as she swept into the bedroom, Sayoko quietly closing the door behind her. Hey there, Nunnally. Putting Lulu through his paces, are you? It is of crucial importance that the pecking order be respected, Nunnally sniffed, lifting her nose into the air over a poorly concealed smile. Thankfully, brother is a good boy and knows who is really in charge around here. Of course I do, Lelouch said, turning not only his head to look at Millie but his swivel chair as well, so his sister would be sure to hear the noise of the move. After all, she just arrived. Good morning, Madam President. Good morning, Lulu. Millie replied happily over Nunnally's squawked outrage. Gotta say, I'm a bit disappointed to find you two truants conspiring here. Without me. Well, Lelouch nodded to Sayoko, who slipped out of the room only to return a moment later pushing another chair into his bedroom. I would say that you are free to join our conspiracy, but... well, you already have. So why not sit down and help Nunnally and I figure out our next step? My pleasure. Millie beamed as she took her seat. Thanks, Sayoko. Tea, please. Certainly, Mistress Millicent, Sayoko murmured, closing the door behind herself again. So, the Ashford heiress turned back to the Lamperouges, the smile remaining but firming up into something slightly more serious than her usual teasing expression. What's the word, Lelouch, Nunnally? Brother has opted to try his hand at iconoclasm, Nunnally brightly replied. Or, I suppose that's the word for torching churches in particular. Arson is somewhat lacking as a description. We have not gotten very far, Lelouch clarified, shooting his sister a quelling look that he was certain she would pick up on somehow, blindness or not. I was discussing with Nunnally what the next offensive operation should be, but that is honestly not the highest priority at the moment, though it might be the most time-sensitive. Strike while the iron is hot and all that. Makes sense, Millie nodded along. So, iconoclasm? Burn down churches to diminish the institutional authority of the church and to advertise the true Anglicans in the process by leaving notes claiming responsibility, Lelouch quickly elaborated, but while that is certainly important, especially since it will destabilize Clovis in an already shaky juncture, I don't think I can reasonably call it the most important task before us. I think, he continued, glancing from his sister to his friend and back, that the true Anglicans are at something of a juncture. Our numbers are growing rapidly, which is good, but our organization is entirely inadequate, which is not. Two heads nodded in agreement. That is true, Nunnally hummed thoughtfully. Say for yourself, your brother Philip, and sister Jane over here, she gestured towards Millie, your congregation is lacking in any form of leadership, quite an impediment to action, and since your church is comprised mostly of scattered cells of hidden worshippers, an impediment to a cohesive identity too. We also need to figure out something to do with new recruits, converts or whatever you want to call them, Millie noted, scratching at her chin. We're getting a pretty nice trickle of newbies either finding their way to us or responding to one of our recruitment campaigns. Even the untargeted campaigns, just the pamphlets hidden in books and such, are meeting with solid success. Probably because of the whole just assassinated a bishop thing. People always love a winner, Lelouch said, nodding along, especially when it comes to matters of faith. Especially, he allowed himself a smile, when the so-called man of God succumbs to a viper's bite. Yes, you were very clever, Millie replied indulgently, but since we don't really have a formalized instruction process or really anywhere to put these new arrivals, we haven't been using them to their full potential. Sergeant Coffin's militia aside, Lelouch noted. The converted noncom had taken to zealously waylaying any convert with military experience and all but press-ganging them into his rapidly growing militia. But yes, I understand your concerns, Millie. I think that we can really break the whole problem of our new recruits down into 3 smaller issues: filtration, education, and organization. Holding up 3 fingers, Lelouch began to expand on each. Since we have been attempting to expand, we have made it easier to find the true Anglicans and to join us, which inevitably presents security concerns. We need to figure out how we can search out potential spies from the Holy Office or the administration in our new converts. Lelouch lowered 1 finger. We also must devise an actual program of beliefs, doctrines, and goals. Lelouch ticked off his 2nd finger now. The old doctrine of the Church must, by necessity, make up the bulk of this program, but we needn't be bound to it fully. Considering how my standing with the congregation now has more to do with the assassination of Lazaro Pulsed and the pastoral care I have administered and less to do with Father Timothy's inherited mantle, we have some breathing room. We need to educate all of the existing congregation and the converts on this doctrine, once we've decided on what that doctrine will be. I have already made a start on this part. Lelouch gestured towards the partial manuscript on his desk, but I would of course welcome both of your input. Finally, organization. The remaining 2 fingers folded and Lelouch settled back in his chair. You were completely correct, Nunnally, about the issues disorganization will inevitably bring. Organization is clearly necessary. At least 1 officer, or deacon or whatever, for every cell seems like the bare minimum to me, along with specialist officers in charge of specific units, projects, or tasks. That's a lot of work, Lulu, Millie observed, and then paused as a knock came from the door. Your tea, ladies and gentlemen, announced Sayoko, her voice somewhat muffled by the door. May I come in? Millie glanced to Lelouch, who nodded. Yes, the Ashford heiress said, standing to open the door for the maid. Please come in, Sayoko. As the Japanese maid and bodyguard arranged the tea service on Lelouch's hastily cleared desk, a reflective silence fell over the room. That lingered as Sayoko poured the tea, wordlessly adding sugar and cream to Nunnally and Millie's cups as fit their preferences, and continued after the maid had bowed herself out of the room once more. Brother, Nunnally said, breaking the silence as she cradled her cup, I believe it would be best if we each took a piece of the puzzle you have laid out before us to focus on. After all, she smiled, there are 3 of us and 3 areas upon which to work. That's quite handy, isn't it? So it is, Lelouch agreed, returning his sister's smile, certain that she was about to ask for something but happy to go along with her requests. Do you have a preference, dear sister? Filtration, came the immediate reply. I have some ideas as to how we might potentially weed out the disloyal and undedicated. Give me some time to sort through them, and I believe you will have little to worry about. All right, Lelouch nodded easily. I have faith in your clever mind. I'm interested in seeing what sort of ideas and theories you come up with. Thank you, brother. Nunnally smiled sweetly up at him. Is your faith in me sufficient to allow me to finally help you start handling the practical side as well? These would be my ideas, after all. I would very much like a chance to implement them. Ah, the words caught in his throat as Lelouch looked at his little sister once again. Her chair sat in a midday sunbeam, whose golden light caught the fine strands of her ash-brown hair in a luminescent blaze that, with her delicate features and soft smile, was positively angelic. Once again, he was struck by just how overbearingly fragile she looked, as if she could be dropped to the floor like the china teacup she cradled and would shatter just the same. But the hands cradling that teacup know the truth, his mind whispered back to him, recalling Nunnally's particular skill to him, and while her arms might be thin and her hands soft, there is some muscle on those arms and a few hard-won calluses on her palms, trophies of physical therapy exercises and the times she uses her manual wheelchair to move under her own power. She understands suffering and endurance. She is not weak, and besides, Lelouch thought with amused discomfort, considering how enthusiastic she has grown in regards to murder and arson, I doubt that any spy she detected would understand just how much danger they stood in until it was far too late. I am not opposed to handing the theory over to you, Lelouch began, not in the slightest, in fact. I have confidence in your clever mind, Nunnally. But I don't know if you will be able to help us put them into practice. You do not want me to place myself into danger, and you wisely do not want to attract attention to us by bringing a herd of strangers onto Ashford grounds. Nunnally's voice was like a sword as it cut through his hemming and hawing, steely and straight to the point. Fine. These are understandable, if disappointing, objections. In that case, I would like you to bring Sayoko in on your plans, brother, so that she may act as my aide in this matter. But then who would take care of you while I was away? Lelouch protested, this time immediately finding the words. Nunnally's safety was, after all, the one point he would not concede. It would be unsafe and irresponsible to leave you bereft of help, should something go wrong. I don't have any issue bringing Sayoko in on our plan, though, he added, deciding to offer his sister a small win. It was an easy thing to offer, since he had already been planning to do just such a thing at some point. Perhaps in a similar capacity as yourself, as an advisor. Maybe more once I finish softening the congregation's views on honoraries. And I don't suppose we can just hire another maid to make sure I don't escape my chair, Nunnally quipped acidly, but then frowned and sighed. No, the vetting would take too long, and your finances are strained enough as is, brother. I understand, it was a foolish idea. Fine, I will handle the theory for security and filtering, with Sayoko's input. I'm sure she'll be able to help, it seems close to her other competency. In that case, Millie slid back into the conversation now that peace between the siblings Lamperouge reasserted itself. I would like to handle the organization of the congregation. After all, and the teasing smile was back as she turned to Lelouch, I believe that's the traditional remit of the minister's wife, isn't it, Leland? I seem to remember something like that, Lelouch coughed, noticing how the frown on his sister's face had returned, and for a moment, deepened. Talk with Philip. I think that he knows pretty much everybody of the old congregation on some level. His recommendations could work as a short list for deacons. Although, it might be to our benefit if the cells nominate their own deacons, just so we can be sure they'll choose leaders they'll be happy to follow. That's pretty much what I was thinking, Millie said with a smile and a clap. It's just like organizing the organization for one of the festivals. Throw a bunch of people into a committee here, set up another committee over there, and then ride herd on the personality conflicts while everybody else handles all the real work. Management is real work too, Millie, Nunnally noted in a mildly reproving tone, but Lelouch relaxed. Whatever bad mood had briefly manifested on his sister's face seemed to have already passed. Just ask brother. Sometimes he spends whole days just managing student council affairs. Surely whatever he is doing in that time wouldn't be anything like slacking. Hey now, Lelouch protested at Millie's reproving glare. I was providing crucial management and oversight. Very important, very crucial. Lelouch's meager defense earned him the light smack of Millie thwacking him across the shoulders with a rolled-up magazine. Anyway, he continued, impervious to his sister's giggling and Millie's ineffectual blows, I suppose that actually coming up with a doctrine will be left to me, as well as a way of passing it on to our church. And don't forget the church burnings. Nunnally hastened to remind him. The state church won't just collapse itself, brother. It is important to be proactive towards the accomplishment of your goals. Something feels off about her enthusiasm. Now, what could it be? I agree completely, Nunnally, Lelouch said aloud, smiling indulgently as he considered his little sister. Setting the topics of her suggestions aside, the vehemence of her insistence was decidedly unusual. She almost seemed desperate. It is of course important to maintain pressure. Does she worry that I will not listen to her unless she advocates the most extreme options available? If so, it was a pointless concern. Lelouch would always have time for his little sister. Now, he turned to Millie, I recall you saying that you had a few ideas regarding new outreach opportunities. Let's discuss those before we dive into the organizational framework. As the conversation continued and ideas traded back and forth slowly coalesced into something approaching policy, Lelouch's focus kept straying to his sister, and to the weight that still shadowed his back. Don't worry, Nunnally, he thought, renewing his old vow. I will never leave you. I will keep you safe, no matter what. Several hours later, Millie declared that she needed a break and dragged Lelouch outside into the mid-afternoon sun, demanding a walk. Enjoy your stroll, brother. Nunnally had called after the two of them, doing nothing to save Lelouch from a blonde brimming with pent-up energy. Yeah, come on Lulu. Millie encouraged, though the way her lips twitched made Lelouch suspect there was a joke here that he wasn't party to. That or his sister and friend were scheming against him, which was entirely plausible. Exercise is key to mental health, you know. He'd only grumbled a bit as he gave in. It wasn't like spending time with Millie was a particularly onerous burden, after all. At least as long as she didn't start trying to organize an impromptu party. The stream of light chatter continued until the door of the student council clubhouse closed behind them. Phew, Millie sighed, and then to Lelouch's alarm sagged against one of the columns of the facade. Lulu. Your sister's getting kinda scary. That's. Lelouch hesitated, not quite able to say that the Ashford heiress's feelings were ridiculous. Mostly because, as disinclined as he generally was to criticize his sister, he thought Millie might have a point. She is just happy to have a way to help, he said at last. You know how much she hates being left out. She just wants to make sure she will remain involved. I know, Millie acknowledged, her voice serious. That doesn't make her any less scary. Remember, Lelouch, we're talking about people's lives here. It's not a game. Alexander lowered into the ground, 9 dripping hides serving as his burial shroud. A much younger Nunnally staring up at him with wide eyes, her hands shaking as they reach out for him from below the pinning weight of their mother's crumpled form. A city of the dead in the heat of summer, swollen hands stretching out for help from under shattered concrete. I know that, Millie, he said, and pretended he didn't hear the momentary waver in his own voice. Nunnally knows that too. Yeah? Millie peered into his face, then nodded. Yeah, guess you do. Uncomfortable under the sudden scrutiny and desperate to not think about true Anglicans, empires, or that man, Lelouch changed topics to the first subject he could think of. How did the swim meet turn out? Shirley took the gold again, I bet. Millie arched an eyebrow at the non sequitur, but, clearly picking up on his discomfort, played along. As a matter of fact, she did. Freestyle, back, and breast stroke, our cutie pie treasurer swept them all. It is entirely possible to mention that style of swimming without the lascivious intonation, Lelouch said chidingly, but smiled in silent thanks for Millie's return to form. Point of fact, I know you are fully capable of saying that name without sounding disreputable. I've heard you say it before. But where's the fun in that, Tilda? Came the blonde's rhetorical reply. You should congratulate her, Lelouch. Seriously. When was the last time you talked to her, huh? Just last Thursday, Lelouch answered quickly, figuratively sweating under Millie's suddenly gimlet-eyed stare. I had to get her to approve the club budget for the next quarter. I meant, when was the last time you spoke to her outside of a council meeting or class? Millie pressed, unmollified. For that matter, when did you last hang out with rivals? I know you haven't been gambling much lately, but surely you can do something else together. I've been busy. Lelouch replied, squirming under the silent yet unrelenting pressure radiating from his co-conspirator. I'll talk to him. What a good idea, Millie declared brightly, the pressure vanishing like dew in sunlight. He's a good friend. You should pay attention to your friends, Lulu. If you get too sucked down into work, you'll be grey by 30, and, while I bet you could pull off the silver fox look, might wanna put that off for a few decades. I already said I'd talk to him, Lelouch grumbled. I don't know what else you could ask for. Consider bringing him in, Millie replied bluntly, serious again as she caught his eye. And before you shut me down by saying you'll think about it and then not doing anything, I'll just tell you that he's been feeling at loose ends lately, since the honorary assistant's efforts shut down and Callan left on that trip with her dad. If you want to encourage the church to soften towards honoraries, he could be a huge help. I'll think about it, Lelouch replied, and then raised a hand to ward off Millie's skeptical expression. Really, I will. The prospect of involving another Ashford student concerns me, but you do make a solid point. I also very much doubt that rivals would thank me for inviting him into the church on the eve of our launching a campaign of terrorism through arson and assassination. No matter how disgruntled with the system he isn't a killer. On the other hand, who would have guessed Millie Ashford would have volunteered to join a murderous conspiracy? Hidden depths. All right, Millie nodded, accepting his answer. Well, with all that out of the way. She waved a hand towards the verdant grounds stretching out all around them and offering her other arm to him. I believe you're still under orders to enjoy a stroll, Lulu. Far be it from me to defy that command, he replied, words ripe with a smile tugging at his lips as he linked his arm around Millie's own, his hand ghosting across the top of hers. Lay on then, Lady Ashford. August 11, 2016 ATB, Old Benji's Public House, Tokyo Settlement, 1630. During the early morning hours of darkness on the occasions that forced the agent to work all-nighters, when moods fey and fanciful overtook him as lack of sleep took its toll, he sometimes imagined himself as a terrier. A ratty, perhaps, small in the greater scheme of things but indefatigable once set upon his queries scent, with paws darting quick and skillfully as they plunged into the dirt, digging down to find the rat his nose told him lurked below. And oh, how he and his cell-mates had dug over the last fortnight. Franklin, a professional woman in her late 40s, said in curt greeting, sliding into the unoccupied bench across from him in the booth. You look like shit. When did you get to bed last night? Bed. The agent, whose name was not Franklin, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, and took a long and pointed sip from his mug of black coffee. His fourth in the last 2 hours. What a strange concept, Mrs. Wilbur. How's the mister doing? He looks like shit too, the woman who was not married bluntly replied, giving the grimy menu a desultory once-over. I haven't been here before, what would you say isn't completely terrible? I'd say the pit pot pie, the agent replied with a pleasant smile whose apparent guilelessness immediately inflamed his conversational partner's suspicions. You would you? She peered at him, the bags under her eyes a match for his own save for the concealer. You'd recommend it, then? Oh, never, the agent demurred. You just asked what I would say isn't completely terrible, I happen to enjoy the alliteration. Happily, he took another sip of coffee. So, he continued after a moment, did Joe manage to schedule an appointment? For the... He trailed off suggestively, as if delicately avoiding any mention of a particularly embarrassing medical condition. Yes, I know, the woman known at times as Mrs. Wilbur snapped, opening her voluminous purse and jerking a stained envelope out. It took some doing and he needs you to sign off on the schedule. Here, she withdrew a folded packet out of the envelope and thrust it into the agent's unoccupied hand, along with a somewhat fancy ballpoint. Just need you to sign on pages 2 and 4, and initial on the last. Oh my, the man who some documents claimed had a cousin named Joseph Wilbur said aloud, seeming to pore over the frankly exorbitant loan schedule detailed on the sheets. I see Christmas isn't coming this year, is it now? Fine, he waved placatingly at the stony woman sitting across from him, as if she'd begun a scolding reply, never let it be said that I don't take care of family. Here. The pen moved, and here. And there you go. Thanks, the person who was possibly in their late 40s, and also probably a woman, grunted, stuffing the signed papers back into their envelope and the envelope back into her purse. I'd stick around, but... She looked around the mostly empty pub, the atmosphere here is terrible. Tar. After the other person left, the man they had called Franklin remained for some time, nursing the steadily cooling cup of coffee as he tried to navigate a rapidly growing digital serpent across the minute screen of his phone. The elegant pen, resting half under the crumpled napkin he had accidentally pushed it under while handing the papers back, was inches from his hand but seemed forgotten. Another cup of coffee and 3 more games of Snake later, the agent stood, hand slipping to the pocket of his trousers as he fumbled in his wallet for a few notes, and left the pub. Nasty place, he muttered as he strolled along the garbage-strewn expanse of 39th Street, hands jammed firmly into his pockets. On the very border of Arcology No. 3, where almost a tenth of the entire commoner population of Tokyo was housed, 39th was a far cry from the shining boulevards of the concession above their heads. Now, his hand re-emerged from his pocket, the false wooden shell of the very ordinary disposable pen wrapped in his palm. A quick twist and the panels split down the middle, revealing a slip of rice paper scrolled tightly around the tube where the real pen had rested. Without breaking stride, the secret leveler quickly skimmed over the note, committing the list of numbers, bracketed in sets of 3 and separated by comma, and the single column of letters, A to J, to memory. Message received, he pretended to cough and popped the scrap into his mouth, gulping the rapidly softening paper down. One half of the shell went into a storm drain, the other into a burnable trash bin a block away. Back in his humble apartment in a much nicer quarter of the settlement, the agent retrieved a dog-eared mass-market paperback copy of Hobbes' Leviathan from his shelf along with a pad of paper and set to work. 10 minutes later, the man whose sobriquet for the day referenced the supposed founder of his hidden order leaned back to read his Society Brothers report. Target location confirmed. Medical research activity confirmed, vivisection observed after organ implant. Objective remains unclear. Next report at. Well, the agent thought, tearing out the used sheet from the notepad as well as several other sheets below it, that explains his ineptitude's fervency to keep this out of the public eye. Why he is concealing his research from the remainder of his administration is unexplained, though, as is the goal for all of this. The report was frustratingly lacking in detail, but it was still cause enough for the agent to claim a personal sense of triumph. Once again, his senses had proven true. The rat still eluded him, but he was unfazed. No matter how many layers of dirt and filth the rat spread to cover his tracks, the agent and his fellow terriers would drag him out onto level ground. And then, just like Charles so long ago, his neck will be bared for the chop,